own brother's wedding, the one I was never invited to, they toasted to my demise. In front of generals and colonels, my stepfather raised a glass and declared my grandfather's legacy was not for a non-commissioned officer like me. They took my inheritance, my name, my honor, but they made one fatal mistake. They thought they were silencing a forgotten granddaughter. They forgot they were picking a fight with a drill sergeant. My name is Camille Foster. I'm 39 years old and a command sergeant major in the United States Army. The scent of power in the officers' club at Fort Myer is a suffocating blend of polished mahogany, expensive bourbon, and unspoken hierarchies. I walked into the grand hall, the crystal chandeliers glittering above, illuminating the expensive Army mess dress uniforms of the generals and colonels. Their medals gleamed like constellations on their chests. In my own Army service uniform, the deep blue fabric crisp and severe, I felt like a misplaced note in a meticulously composed symphony. It wasn't that I wasn't proud of it. This uniform was earned with my own blood, sweat, and grit. But here, in this room, it was a signal of a different world. The world of the doers, not the politicians in uniform. Across the room, I saw my younger brother, Captain Evan Foster, laughing with his new father-in-law, the retired Colonel Leland Thorne. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Evan froze, his smile faltering, before he quickly turned away, as if acknowledging me was a social misstep. The isolation began at the threshold. A young lieutenant with a practiced, insincere smile intercepted me before I could take another step. "Command Sergeant Major," he said, his tone a little too loud, his eyes flicking to the chevrons on my sleeve. The address was formally correct, but it felt like a label, a classification. "I'm afraid the tables for the Vance family are fully committed." He didn't look at me as he spoke, his gaze fixed on a guest list on his podium. He pointed a dismissive finger toward a dark corner of the room. "Table 17 is available. It's over there, by the kitchen entrance." Table 17. A small, solitary round table, set for one, tucked away behind a massive marble pillar. From there, I could hear the clatter of dishes and the muffled rhythm of the jazz band. But I couldn't see the main stage. The message was brutally clear. You are not one of us. Sit here and be invisible. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cold knot in my chest tightening. I walked to my assigned seat, my back straight, a habit from my drill sergeant days. It was the only thing holding me together. A soldier never lets the enemy see they've been hit. Lauren, Evan's new bride, glided onto the stage, a vision in a Vera Wang gown. After a few saccharine thank yous, her eyes found mine across the room. Her smile was sweet as honey, but her eyes were chips of ice. "And of course," she said, her voice dripping with dramatic flair, "a very special toast to Evan's steadfast sister, Command Sergeant Major Foster." She paused, letting the title hang in the air. "Thank you for taking precious time away from the training grounds at Fort Jackson to be with us. This family can always use someone to keep us all in line, can't we?" A ripple of condescending chuckles spread through the officers' tables. They saw me as she intended, a glorified gym teacher, a tool for shouting at recruits, not a leader. I sat ramrod straight, my hands clasped in my lap, my face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. I felt my knuckles turn white as I gripped the linen napkin under the table. Before the sting of her words could fade, Colonel Leland Thorne rose to his feet, raising his glass of Macallan 18. "Hear, hear," he boomed, his voice oozing a false paternal warmth. "My stepdaughter has always been a model of persistence. The word was an insult disguised as a compliment. She chose her own path, a more hands-on approach. She is the backbone of the army, it's true. He surveyed the room of powerful men. But the Vance legacy, the legacy of this family, requires strategic minds, leaders forged at West Point, to guide it. It is not a legacy for a non-commissioned officer. He spat the last words out, a final public damnation. In front of everyone I respected and everyone I despised, he had just declared me, General Vance's own granddaughter, unworthy of his name. He had erased me. The air grew thick with awkward silence and smug satisfaction. And then a figure rose from the head table, General Marcus Peters, a living legend from Delta Force, a man whose exploits were whispered with awe on every military base. He walked past the tables, a path clearing before him as if by an invisible force. He stopped directly in front of my lonely table. The room held its breath. He didn't speak. He simply came to attention and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. Command Sergeant Major. His voice was a low, powerful rumble that carried through the silent hall. Your service does honor to the United States Army. He held my gaze. Your grandfather once told me, true leaders are forged in the mud of Fort Benning, not on the manicured lawns of West Point. He was talking about you, Camille. The room was utterly still. I looked past him and saw Leland Thorne's face, pale and slack-jawed, as if he'd just seen a ghost. My honor, the very thing they had tried to strip from me, had just been handed back, polished and gleaming by a true warrior. I offered the slightest of nods, my throat too tight to speak. General Peters's words echoed in my mind, a lifeline in a sea of contempt. But was it enough? If my grandfather truly believed in me, what happened to his final wishes? What was written in that will? The question of my grandfather's true wishes, sparked by General Peters's salute, was a fragile hope I carried into the lion's den. The Vance Foundation's office in Georgetown was a testament to old money and influence, a stately brownstone that smelled of lemon oil and quiet power. But inside the conference room, the air was as cold and sterile as a morgue. Colonel Thorne sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking every bit the chairman of the board. Beside him were two lawyers from K&L Gates, their tailored suits and thin-rimmed glasses screaming DC influence. My brother Evan sat across from them, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table, refusing to meet mine. My cousin, Major Olivia Vance, a JAG officer herself, had chosen a seat in the corner, a self-imposed exile that spoke volumes. I took the seat directly opposite Thorne, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. Dex stood behind me, a silent, formidable wall. The stage was set. The older lawyer, a man named Sterling, cleared his throat. His voice was a passionless monotone, like an automated weather report, as he droned through the preamble about maintaining General Vance's legacy, about the unwavering commitment to our nation's veterans. Then he arrived at the payload. As per the final directive, amended and notarized on October 15th, he read, his voice never wavering, full control of the Vance Foundation, along with all its associated assets, shall be transferred to a new board of trustees, headed by Colonel Leland Thorne. Additional members include Captain Evan Foster and Mrs. Lauren Foster. He paused, folding the paper with a crisp final sound. The silence in the room was absolute. My name had not been mentioned, not once. It was as if I had never existed. Leland Thorne broke the silence with a condescending, practiced smile. A smile I had seen 100 times in my childhood. usually right before he delivered a crushing remark. "Camille," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I know this may come as a bit of a shock, but these were the General's final wishes. He wanted to streamline the organization, place it in the hands of those with a strategic vision, to ensure you understand that his legacy is sustained for generations to come." He spoke of my grandfather's legacy as if it were a corporate holding to be managed. He had just stolen my birthright, and now he was lecturing me on how to protect it. I stared directly into his eyes, my own face a blank mask. My silence, I knew, was more unnerving to him than any scream. I would not give him the satisfaction. The meeting was adjourned. As Dex and I walked into the hallway, Olivia rushed to catch up. "CSM Foster, Camille," she whispered, her hand trembling as she pressed a small USB drive into my palm. "I'm so sorry, I tried. This was a draft from a month ago, before they locked me out of the servers." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear, then hurried away. The tiny device felt cold and heavy in my hand. It wasn't just a piece of hardware, it was the last flicker of conscience in a family consumed by greed. I closed my fist around it, drawing a strange strength from her small, courageous act of defiance. This was my first piece of ammunition. Down in the parking garage, inside the familiar cab of Dex's Ford F-150, the world outside seemed to disappear. He plugged the USB into his ruggedized laptop. A document appeared on the screen, a draft of the directive, and there it was in black and white. "My sole successor for the chairmanship of the Vance Foundation shall be my granddaughter, CSM Camille Foster." A breath I didn't know I was holding escaped my lungs, but that wasn't all. "They were sloppy," Dex muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the server backup he had covertly made. "Damn it," he swore softly. "Look at this, Camille." He pointed to the screen, a system log. It showed a critical file being deleted and overwritten at 2:13 a.m., just hours after my grandfather passed. The timestamp was a cold digital tombstone. "And guess where the IP address originated?" Dex said, his voice now hard as steel. "A residential IP registered to the private home of Colonel Leland Thorne, Alexandria, Virginia." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The clinical, undeniable proof. They hadn't just changed the will. They had broken in, like thieves in the night, digitally, to erase me from my own family's history. Alexandria, Virginia. The house he shared with my mother. The house where so many of my childhood hopes had gone to die. Suddenly, I wasn't in Dex's truck anymore. I was a little girl again, standing invisible in their perfect living room. I sat in my small Arlington apartment, the glow of Dex's laptop casting long shadows on the wall. The cold, hard code detailing Thorne's intrusion had unlocked a door in my mind, a door I had spent years trying to barricade. My gaze drifted to an old photograph on my bookshelf, its frame dusty. It was a Thanksgiving portrait, taken the year I turned 17, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. My mother, Elena, stood in the center, her arm wrapped proudly around Evan, a lanky teenager in his stiff military academy uniform. Beside them, Colonel Thorne placed a proprietary hand on Evan's shoulder. And then there was me. I was on the very edge of the frame, nearly cropped out, wearing a plain high school track team t-shirt. There was no smile on my face. I remembered the photographer saying, "Camille, can you squeeze in a little closer?" And my mother waving a dismissive hand. "It's fine, just take the picture. The focus is on the son who will carry on the family tradition." The memory stung, sharp and familiar. it brought another one with it. I was 15, and I had just won the state track and field championship. I had run like my life depended on it, my lungs burning, and crossed the finish line first. I brought the gleaming gold trophy home, thinking, finally, I had something they could be proud of. I placed it on the fireplace mantel, right next to Evan's academic awards. It was still there when I went to bed. The next morning, it was gone. I found it in the bottom of a trash can in the garage, nestled among coffee grounds and junk mail. When I confronted my mother, her face was a mask of weary disapproval. "Camille, darling, these things are frivolous," she'd sighed. "You should be focusing on your studies, on a stable future, not running around a track like a boy." It wasn't concern in her voice, it was shame. The only person who ever saw me, truly saw me, was my grandfather. Every summer, he would drive down from Virginia to our house near Fort Bragg and rescue me. He'd take me to his farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a world away from the suffocating pressure of my home. He never made me learn etiquette or play the piano. He taught me how to read a topographical map, how to navigate by the stars, and how to handle his old Winchester rifle. "You have the heart of a soldier, Camille," he'd say, his large, warm hand on my shoulder. His words were a compass in the wilderness of my childhood. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you are not enough. You have the blood of the Vances in your veins. It's the blood of warriors." Those words became my North Star. They were the reason that at 18, I stood at a crossroads. Evan had received his acceptance letter from West Point, a cause for endless celebration in our house. I had received a letter too, but mine was from a Spartan Army recruitment office downtown. That night, my hands trembling, I called my grandfather. "Grandpa," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I don't think I'm going to college. I'm going to enlist." The silence on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. I expected disappointment. Instead, his voice came back, infirm with pride. "Good, Camille. That's a brave choice. That path will be harder, but it will make you a real leader. Go and make me proud." That phone call sealed my fate. The last time I saw him, 6 months before he passed, he was frail, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. We sat in his study, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, sipping the sweet iced tea he loved. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Camille, I've set things right," he whispered, his voice raspy. "This legacy, it needs a brave heart and a steady hand. I trust you." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I won't let you down, Grandpa." Now, staring at the digital trail of betrayal on the screen, I realized Thorn must have been there all along. A vulture circling, waiting for the right moment to twist my grandfather's final words, to turn his faith in me into a lie. The grief of his loss and the fury of this betrayal merged into a single, cold resolve. They had spent years trying to erase me. What did I do? I decided to build myself, brick by painful brick, into someone they could never tear down. They had spent years trying to erase me. What did I do? I decided to build myself, brick by painful brick, into someone they could never tear down. The summer heat at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, doesn't smell of bourbon and mahogany. It smells of damp red clay, the sharp tang of cordite after a day on the range, and the collective sweat of hundreds of raw recruits who wonder if they've made the biggest mistake of their lives. That was my new world, my self-chosen crucible. While Evan was studying Clausewitz and battlefield strategy in the air-conditioned lecture halls of West Point, I was low-crawling under barbed wire, my face pressed into the dirt. the roar of drill sergeants a constant, motivating thunder in my ears. I remember my first meal in the mess hall. It was a utilitarian metal tray holding a slab of dry turkey, a scoop of bland mashed potatoes, and green beans that had been boiled into submission. But to me, it tasted like freedom. It was a meal I had earned. No one had given it to me. No one had arranged it for me. Every single bite was a deliberate step away from the suffocating shadow of the Vance family. The final test of basic combat training is a grueling 96-hour field exercise called the Forge. It's designed to do exactly that, to heat you until you bend or break, and then hammer you into something new, something stronger. We carried 90-pound rucks over what felt like endless miles of sandhills, navigated treacherous terrain in the dead of night, and faced simulated combat scenarios that robbed us of sleep and pushed us to the edge of delirium. I remember the third night vividly. A torrential downpour had turned the earth into a cold, muddy soup as we desperately dug our fighting positions. My body was a symphony of pain, every muscle screaming in protest, my hands raw and bleeding inside my gloves. The recruit next to me, a quiet kid from Ohio, finally broke. He started to cry, his shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. I looked at his desperate face, then up at the black, unforgiving sky. I thought of Evan, probably warm and dry in the hallowed halls of the West Point Library, and then I thought of my grandfather. True leaders are forged in the mud. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the fire in my shoulders, and kept digging. The next morning, when we finally completed the exercise and stood for the rite of passage ceremony, I wasn't tired anymore. I felt like I had been reborn in that mud, stripped down to my very core and built back stronger, someone they would no longer recognize. A few years later, I returned to Fort Jackson, not as a recruit, but with the authoritative brown campaign hat of a drill sergeant on my head. My new mission was to turn scared, soft civilians into soldiers. I was strict, I was demanding. I pushed them to their limits because I knew what lay on the other side of that pain, resilience. But I never humiliated them. I never made them feel worthless. I would look each private in the eye, see the fear and the hope warring there, and say, I am not here to break you. I am here to show you the strength you never knew you had. In their eventual success, in their transformation, I became the leader I had desperately needed in my own youth, a tough but fair mentor. The letters I received years later from those soldiers, now sergeants and officers themselves, thanking me for changing their lives, became the validation my own family never gave me. They were my true medals. My first deployment was to Fallujah, Iraq, during the height of the insurgency. The blistering heat was a physical presence, the constant thud of mortars a part of the city's heartbeat, and the threat of suicide bombers a shadow that followed us everywhere. One evening, a call came through on the satellite phone. It was Evan. "Camille," he said, his voice awkward and distant. "Mom and Colonel Thorne. They think you shouldn't be in such a dangerous place. They said you should request a transfer to a desk job in Germany or something." I looked out the narrow window of my concrete bunker at the soldiers of my platoon, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination as they prepared for a night patrol. "Evan," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the gravel outside. "You tell them I'm exactly where I belong. I'm with my family." I hung up. My family was right here, the men and women who would share their last MRE with me, who would cover my six without a second thought. They were my blood now. With every promotion, from sergeant to staff sergeant, and all the way up to command sergeant major, I sent a brief, professional email to my mother. "I've been promoted." The reply was always a variation of the same theme. "That's nice, dear. Take care of yourself." No congratulations, no questions, no pride. When Evan made captain, I saw from my Aunt Carol's Facebook page that they threw a lavish party for him at the prestigious Army and Navy Club in D.C. There was a photo of him and Thorne, beaming, raising champagne flutes. I looked at that picture on my phone, then at the framed certificate on my wall. The piece of paper that made me a command sergeant major. It didn't glitter like champagne, but it was heavier. It was forged from honor, sweat, and sacrifice. That piece of paper on my wall wasn't just a promotion. It was a declaration of independence. But independence can be a lonely road. And on that road sometimes you meet the only family you'll ever need. That piece of paper on my wall wasn't just a promotion. It was a declaration of independence. But independence can be a lonely road. And on that road sometimes you meet the only family you'll ever need. For me, that was Chief Warrant Officer 4 Dexter Hayes. The Egress is a small, unassuming veterans bar tucked away on a quiet street in Arlington. It's not fancy. The exposed brick walls are covered in faded unit flags and grainy black and white photos of forgotten firefights. The air smells of stale beer and shared history. It's our sanctuary. Dex and I sat in our usual corner booth, 2 glasses of Port City Optimal Wit, sweating onto the worn wooden table between us. I laid out the entire ugly story from the wedding reception to the lawyer's office, my voice growing hoarse with the effort of keeping it steady. I didn't cry. My training wouldn't allow it, but the pain was a physical weight in my chest. Dex just listened, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, "It'll be okay," or "Don't let them get to you." He just sat there, his silent presence a powerful affirmation. "I hear you. I believe you. I am here." In a world of carefully crafted words and hidden agendas, his silence was the most honest thing I had heard all week. I met Dex in the dust and chaos of Afghanistan. He's a signal intelligence warrant officer, a tech wizard who can make ghosts dance in the machine. Our unit was pinned down in an ambush, our communications cut, and we were effectively blind and alone. It was Dex who, under a hail of enemy fire, jury-rigged a satellite uplink and re-established our comms, coordinating the air support that saved all our lives. We became friends after that, a friendship forged not in conversation, but in shared risk. We didn't talk about feelings. We demonstrated trust through action. I remember one afternoon on the firing range back stateside, he turned to me and said, "CSM, you ever need anything? An Overwatch, a cryptologist, or just someone to drink a beer with? You make the call, anytime." It wasn't just talk. It was a soldier's oath. And now, in this new kind of war, a war fought in boardrooms and server logs, he was here, honoring that oath. When I finished my story, Dex took a long pull from his beer. He set the glass down with a definitive thud. "They don't just disrespect you, Camille," he said, his voice low and certain. "They fear you. Thorne is terrified because you are the living embodiment of everything he pretends to be, but isn't. A self-made soldier, respected for your grit, not your connections. Evan is afraid because you are a mirror reflecting his own weakness and compromise. And Lauren," he scoffed, "Lauren is afraid because you're the one thing in this family that can't be bought with her father's money or status." Dex's words cut through the fog of my own hurt and self-doubt like a laser. For the first time, I wasn't seeing their actions as a rejection of my worth, but as a terrified reaction to my strength. They weren't trying to get rid of me because I was weak. They were trying to get rid of me because I was a threat to their entire hollow empire. Later that night, Dex had me over to his apartment. It was a simple, clean place, decorated with maps and military memorabilia. He didn't cook anything fancy. He made American goulash, a hearty, unpretentious stew of ground beef, macaroni, and tomatoes. A comfort food his mom used to make. We ate from simple ceramic bowls, drinking tap water from glasses. There was no linen tablecloth, no crystal, no pretense. It was the best meal I'd had in years. It tasted of sincerity, of an unspoken, unwavering friendship. As I watched him across the small kitchen table, listening intently as I started to talk through strategy, I had a profound realization. Family isn't just the people who share your blood. Family is the person who cooks you a hot meal when your world is falling apart. Family is the person who stands with you in the dark. Before I left, Dex handed me a new external hard drive. It was heavy and solid in my hand. "This is military-grade encrypted," he said, his expression serious. "Every piece of evidence we find, every file we recover, it goes on here. We're going to build a case file against Thorn, something so airtight he won't be able to breathe. This is no longer a family matter, Camille. It's an operation. And in this operation, you are the commander. I'm your SIGINT specialist. Give me my orders, CSM." His words shifted the very ground beneath my feet. He was right. I wasn't a grieving granddaughter anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was a commander, and it was time to plan my counteroffensive. He was right. I wasn't a grieving granddaughter anymore. I was a commander, and it was time to plan my counteroffensive. But the enemy, it seemed, had their own ideas. A week after the disastrous meeting, an email from my mother, Elena, appeared in my inbox. The subject line contained just 2 words, family dinner. The message was equally brief. "Saturday, 7 p.m. at the Palm. Your father and I and Evan will be expecting you. We need to talk." There was no apology, no explanation. It was a summons disguised as an invitation. For a fleeting second, my heart clenched, the conditioned reflex of a child who had spent a lifetime craving approval. But then, the image of Thorn's smug face and Evan's averted eyes flashed in my mind. I remembered what Dex had said. This wasn't an olive branch, it was a trap. I replied to the email with a single word, confirmed. I would go. Not as a wounded daughter, but as a commander, gathering intelligence on the opposition. The Palm restaurant in downtown D.C. was suffocating with the smell of sizzling steak, expensive cigars, and political power. The walls were covered in the famed caricatures of politicians and lobbyists, a gallery of the city's elite. Thorn had reserved a private corner booth, a stage for his performance. He looked relaxed in a tailored Xenia suit, swirling a glass of Macallan 18. My mother sat stiffly, her fingers nervously twisting the pearl necklace at her throat. Evan stared intently at the breadbasket. "Camille, I'm so glad you could make it," Thorn began, his voice dripping with the false warmth of a benevolent patriarch. "We've been worried about you. After the general's passing, you've seemed a bit strained. We just want to make sure you're all right." The hypocrisy was so thick, I could almost taste it. He had just orchestrated the theft of my inheritance, and now he was feigning concern for my mental well-being. The waiter brought our steaks, and Thorn, after taking a deliberate, performative bite, got to the point. "We understand the will may have been a shock," he said, smoothly cutting another piece of his filet mignon. "But it was done to protect the legacy. However, we don't want you to feel left out." He dabbed his lips with a napkin. "The board has decided to establish a new Women Veterans Outreach Fund. We would like you to be its honorary ambassador." He let the words hang in the air. There would be an annual stipend, of course, a significant one. Enough for you to live comfortably without having to endure the dust of all those deployments. I set my fork down with a quiet click. They were trying to buy my silence. They wanted to turn me into a paid figurehead, a token CSM, to legitimize their theft. My mother nodded eagerly. "Yes, Camille, it's a wonderful opportunity, isn't it?" I didn't look at Thorn. My eyes were locked on my brother. "Evan," I asked, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, "what do you think about this?" He flinched, startled to be addressed directly. He glanced nervously at Thorn, then down at his half-eaten steak. I think it's a good idea, Camille. It would be good for you." His voice was a barely audible mumble. For a moment I saw the skinny little boy who used to hide behind me when the neighborhood bullies came around. But that boy was gone. In his place sat Captain Foster of the United States Army, a man who had chosen his own comfort over the truth, over his own sister. His quiet, cowardly complicity hurt more than all of Thorn's arrogant pronouncements. It was the deepest betrayal of all. I took a slow sip of ice water, letting the cold clarity wash through me. Then I turned my full attention to Thorn, my gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "Thank you for the offer," I said, my voice low and sharp, each word a carefully aimed shot. "But I am not interested in your fund, and I do not need your stipend. I am interested in one thing, and one thing only, the truth about my grandfather's will." The air in our private corner turned frigid. Thorn's practiced smile vanished. My mother gasped. "Camille, how can you say such a thing?" she whispered, horrified. I stood up, placing my napkin neatly on the table beside my untouched plate. My time as a victim was over. My time as a passive observer was over. The rage I had been suppressing for weeks finally solidified into a cold, hard resolve. "I am going to find out the truth," I stated, my voice calm but leaving no room for doubt. "With or without any of your help. This dinner is over." I turned my back on their shocked faces, on the life they represented, and walked away. I had just declared war. Right there, walking out of that restaurant, I made a choice. There was no going back. If you had been in my shoes, listening to that offer, seeing your own brother turn away, would you have done the same thing? If you would have walked out and declared war, type a 1 in the comments. If you think there was another way, I want to hear it. My declaration of war at the Palm had been a strategic move, a calculated shift in the battle lines. But I hadn't anticipated their countermove would be so swift, so utterly profane, so deeply wounding. A few days later, on a gray and solemn November morning, I drove through the gates of Arlington National Cemetery. It was my grandfather's birthday. It was a ritual I kept every year, a solitary pilgrimage, to place a single stem of his favorite white lily on his grave. I walked through the endless silent rows of white headstones, each one a story of sacrifice, each one a monument to a life given for this country. The air here was hallowed, filled with a quiet dignity that I rarely found anywhere else. It was a place that demanded respect. As I walked the familiar path up the hill, a line from the 23rd Psalm, one he often quoted during tough times, came to my mind. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." It wasn't about religion for him. It was about finding strength in the darkest of valleys. I reached his gravesite, set on a gentle slope overlooking the Lincoln Memorial. And then I froze. Someone was already there. Thorn, Lauren, and Evan. But they weren't there to mourn. They were flanked by a professional media crew, complete with high-definition cameras, boom mics, and portable lighting that cast an artificial, garish glow on the sacred space. Thorne was in the middle of an interview with a reporter from some glossy DC Society magazine, the kind that features galas and political power players. Yes, he was saying, his face a mask of feigned solemnity. General Vance was a great visionary. He understood that for the Foundation to thrive, it needed new, more dynamic leadership. He entrusted his legacy to us, knowing we would carry his mission forward. Lauren stood beside him, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. A flawless performance of grief. They were turning my grandfather's sacred resting place, this hallowed ground, into a cheap PR stage to legitimize their crime. The cold resolve in my chest began to heat up, a slow burning rage, like the core of a nuclear reactor going critical. This was a desecration of the highest order. I walked forward, my steady, deliberate steps on the damp grass silencing their production. The camera crew faltered. The reporter looked up, startled by my sudden appearance in my crisp uniform. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low and devoid of any warmth, cutting through the manufactured reverence. Thorne turned, a flash of pure annoyance in his eyes, before he quickly replaced it with his usual condescending smile. "Camille, we are paying our respects to the General, something a good soldier like you should understand." Then his gaze fell to the single white lily in my hand, a flower that represented a private, cherished memory between me and my grandfather. A cruel smirk touched his lips. "Still with the sentimental gestures, I see," he sneered softly, for only me to hear. "He needs a living legacy, Camille, not dead flowers." And that was it. That was the last straw. The final, unforgivable blow. He wasn't just insulting me anymore. He was insulting the memory of my grandfather, the love my grandfather had for simple, honest things, and the profound personal love I held for him. Something cold and terrible snapped deep inside me. The years of discipline, the ironclad control of a command sergeant major, it all evaporated, burned away by a primal fury that was raw and absolute. This wasn't a soldier anymore. This was a granddaughter whose sacred ground had been violated. I stepped forward until I was inches from his face, my eyes holding his, channeling every ounce of my rage into that single point of contact. "You have made a fatal miscalculation, Colonel," I said, my voice a low, dangerous growl that promised violence. "You underestimated me, and you have desecrated the one memory I will never, ever forgive anyone for touching." I didn't shout. I spoke with a terrifying clarity, letting each word sink into him like a shard of ice. "The game is over. From this moment on, I am not just coming for what is mine. I am going to burn everything you have built on your lies to the very ground." I turned on my heel and walked away, not looking back, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I heard Evan call my name, a weak, pleading sound, but I ignored it as if it were the wind. I marched straight to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs, an adrenaline dump flooding my system. I had just crossed my personal Rubicon. This was no longer a campaign for the truth, it was a war of annihilation. Sitting in the driver's seat, my hands still shaking with the aftermath of my rage, my mind was sharper and clearer than it had ever been. I pulled out my phone, my fingers swiping quickly through my contacts until I found the name, David Chen, Stars and Stripes. When he answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Chen, this is Command Sergeant Major Foster," I said, my voice steady now, cold and hard as steel. "I have a story for you, a story of betrayal, greed, and a stolen military legacy. Are you interested?" There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line, and then, his voice laced with the unmistakable thrill of a real story, he replied, "I'm listening, Sergeant Major." My call to David Chen wasn't just a call, it was the first shot fired in a war. The rage from Arlington Cemetery had cooled, solidifying into something far more dangerous, a cold, methodical purpose. My grief was now locked away. My pain was repurposed as fuel. Dex's apartment in Arlington transformed overnight into our forward operating base, our war room. He had mounted a large whiteboard on his living room wall, which was now covered in a complex web of names, timelines, and potential vulnerabilities. The org chart of the Vance Foundation, the personal and professional connections of Leland Thorne. 3 laptops hummed constantly, their screens a chaotic dance of code, legal documents, and satellite maps of Georgetown. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the electric intensity of a command center before an operation. Dex, on his 4th cup of black coffee, typed with a speed that blurred his fingers. Major Olivia Vance, our legal counsel, joined us via an encrypted video link, her face pale and tense on one of the screens, but her eyes sharp and resolute. I stood in the center of it all, not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a commander surveying the battlefield. This was no longer a war of emotion. It was a war of information, and we were about to seize the high ground. "I'm in," Dex announced suddenly, a rare note of triumph in his voice. He swiveled in his chair. The general's personal server, old Colonel Cole, came through with the override codes. He pointed to his main monitor. A hidden folder named Final Directive HVI pulsed on the screen. Inside were 6 files. 5 were numbered PDFs, but 1 was a video file. I held my breath as Dex double-clicked it. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was in his study, looking weary from his illness, but his eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence I remembered. "If you're watching this, Camille," his familiar voice rasped from the speakers, "it means Leland has made his move. He's a snake, always has been. But I've left you the weapons. Use them for honor." The video ended abruptly. My throat was tight, but there was no time for tears. Dex clicked open another file, a draft of an email. It was a scathing message to his lawyer, detailing his intent to make me his sole successor. The timestamp was a digital bombshell, 10:41 p.m. April 12th. The very night Leland Thorne was delivering a keynote speech at a security conference in Berlin, Germany. He couldn't have been in Virginia to witness any amendments. We had him. Our next target was the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Armed with my command sergeant major credentials and a formal request, authorized by Major Olivia, I was granted access to the secured military records repository. We weren't looking for paper. We were looking for Box 47B, a small metal container, sealed with the red wax emblem of the Department of Defense, a protocol reserved for highly sensitive directives. A technician with white gloves brought it to our private viewing room. After breaking the seal, I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single manila envelope. The title was handwritten in my grandfather's sharp, angular script. Final Property Directive, Harrison J. Vance. It was dated 2 weeks before his death. I read the key clause, my heart pounding. All assets and control of the Vance Foundation shall be transferred exclusively to my granddaughter, CSM Camille Foster. This designation is irrevocable unless I am declared legally incompetent by a military tribunal. No one, not even Thorne, had ever dared to challenge my grandfather's mental state. This wasn't just a smoking gun. This was the silver bullet. We celebrated our victory at a Waffle House off I-95, the smell of sizzling bacon, a welcome contrast to the musty archives. Over coffee and scattered, smothered hash browns, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Camille? The voice was trembling, almost unrecognizable. It was Evan. I can't do this anymore, he stammered, his voice cracking. Thorne made me sign some papers. He said they were just formalities for the transition. I didn't know he was going to cut you out completely. I didn't know how far he would go. He was sobbing now. I have copies, I'll send them to you. I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a cold, strategic recognition. I didn't say thank you, I didn't offer comfort. Send them, Evan, I said, my voice even. It's the only right thing you can do now. I ended the call. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a crack in the enemy's armor. For the first time in his life, Evan's weakness had become my weapon. Back in the war room, we laid out our arsenal on the whiteboard. The original sealed directive from Nora, my grandfather's video testimony, Thorne's digital alibi, and now the fraudulent documents from Evan, proving a conscious effort to deceive. David Chen, the Stars and Stripes reporter, looked at the collection of evidence, his eyes gleaming with professional hunger. We have enough to bury him, he said. I shook my head, a grim smile on my face. Burying him isn't enough, I replied. We need to expose him, in front of the entire world he worships. The plan crystallized in that moment, a coordinated, multi-front assault. David would publish his explosive, deeply sourced investigation on the morning of Memorial Day. Simultaneously, Major Olivia would file an emergency petition in federal court, citing fraud and requesting an immediate freeze of all Foundation assets. And Dex would prepare a digital package, a surgical strike designed for maximum public impact. The plan was set. 3 fronts, 1 target. Memorial Day would no longer be just a day of remembrance. For Leland Thorne, it was going to be Judgment Day. The plan was set. 3 fronts, 1 target. Memorial Day would no longer be just a day of remembrance. For Leland Thorne, it was going to be Judgment Day. The air at the Women in Military Service for America. Memorial at Arlington was thick with a solemn gravity. Thousands had gathered, Pentagon officials in their sharpest uniforms, Gold Star families clutching folded flags to their chests, and veterans whose weathered faces told stories of wars long past. The event was being broadcast live on C-SPAN. On the main stage, Colonel Leland Thorne, resplendent in his dress blues, his chest a billboard of medals, was delivering a saccharine speech about the legacy of sacrifice. Beside him, Lauren played the part of the grieving, supportive daughter-in-law to perfection, her expression a carefully composed mask of sorrow. They were the picture of a model military family, a flawless performance for the cameras. I stood near the back of the crowd next to Dex, my own uniform a stark, unadorned contrast. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with the cold, focused excitement of a soldier in the moments before an assault. 30 minutes ago, David Chen's investigative piece had gone live on the Stars and Stripes website. I could see the glow of smartphones throughout the crowd as notifications began to buzz. The storm was making landfall. And the legacy of General Vance, a legacy of honor and integrity, will be carried forward by us, with all the reverence it deserves, Thorne was saying, his voice resonating with false emotion. As he paused for dramatic effect, The massive LED screen behind him flickered. The Vance Foundation logo vanished. In its place, my grandfather's face appeared, aged and weary, but his eyes were blazing. His voice, amplified by the powerful sound system, echoed across the memorial grounds. "If you're watching this, Camille," he rasped, "it means Leland has made his move." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne spun around, his face instantly draining of all color. "Cut it, cut the feed," he hissed at the technical crew offstage. But it was too late. From a nondescript van parked a quarter-mile away, Dex had seized control of the entire system. The screen cut to the audio file of Thorne's phone call, his voice clear and cold, ordering the lawyer to handle me. Then, the forged documents Evan had provided flashed on the screen, side by side with the authentic versions, the fraudulent signatures highlighted in red. The entire plaza fell into a stunned, horrified silence. Lauren froze, a porcelain doll cracking under the sudden, harsh glare of the truth. Her perfect composure shattered. As the audio of Thorne blackmailing her played next, his voice a venomous whisper, threatening to ruin Evan if she didn't comply. She staggered back a step. "No, that's not," she mumbled, her words swallowed by the awful silence. The press corps, smelling blood, erupted. Camera flashes strobed across her face like machine gun fire. She turned desperately to her husband, Captain Evan Foster, her eyes pleading for him to save her, to deny it all, to maintain the fiction. But Evan didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on me, across the sea of faces. I saw a storm of emotions in his eyes, shame, guilt, regret, and something that looked terrifyingly like relief. And then he did something that sealed their fate. He took one slow, deliberate step backward, away from his wife, creating a chasm between them that would never be bridged. The performance was over. The stage had been torn down. As the screen went black, the silence was broken. Not by boos or jeers, but by something far more powerful. In the front row, an old Marine in a wheelchair, a man who had likely seen the horrors of Khe-Sanh, slowly, painstakingly, lifted his hand to his brow in a salute. He was saluting me. Then another veteran, a woman in an Air Force cap, stood and did the same, and another. In a wave of silent, unified power, the entire section of veterans and active duty service members, hundreds of them, rose to their feet. They didn't say a word. They just stood, their eyes on me, and rendered a solemn, perfect salute. A salute of recognition, a salute for a true commander. Tears, hot and unexpected, began to stream down my face, the first I had shed in years. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication. In the midst of that breathtaking, emotional tableau, two men in dark suits and conservative ties, their NCIS badges clipped to their belts, walked calmly onto the stage. They bypassed the hysterical Lauren and the paralyzed Evan and walked directly to Colonel Leland Thorne, who stood as if turned to stone. "Colonel Leland Thorne," one of the agents said, his voice amplified by the still live microphone for the entire world to hear. "You are under arrest on suspicion of inheritance fraud, document forgery, and misuse of nonprofit funds." The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the memorial. It was the sound of justice. Thorne didn't struggle. He didn't protest. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a pure, impotent hatred. But I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I watched him being led away, a king deposed from his cardboard throne. The battle was over. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. I watched him disappear, a king deposed from his cardboard throne. The battle was over. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. A few weeks later, I drove alone up the winding roads into the Blue Ridge Mountains, the air growing cooler and cleaner with every mile. My grandfather's farm was just as I remembered it, a rustic log house standing sturdy against the elements, surrounded by rolling pastures and the quiet wisdom of ancient oak trees. That evening, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the one he and I had sat in front of on so many cold nights. I took the forged will, Thorne's testament of lies, and placed it on the grate. I struck a single match. The flame licked at the edges of the heavy paper, the ink of his false signature, blackening and curling into nothingness. I watched the names of Thorne, Lauren, and Evan turn to smoke. I watched until every word of their deceit had become ash. I wasn't burning it out of hatred. I was burning it for release, to free my grandfather's memory from its desecration, and to free myself from the suffocating weight of the past. As the last embers glowed and faded, I knew that a chapter of my life had well and truly closed. The air in the cabin already felt lighter, cleaner. The next morning I was sitting on the wide porch swing, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands, watching the mist burn off the green mountains, when a dusty truck pulled up the gravel driveway. It was Evan, alone. He looked thinner, worn down, the polished confidence of a captain stripped away, leaving behind someone I hadn't seen in years. He didn't say anything at first, just walked up the wooden steps and handed me a small velvet-covered box. Inside, resting on faded silk, was the original Vance family crest, a heavy silver heirloom passed down through generations. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice raspy, with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Lauren, we've filed for divorce. I've also put in for a transfer to a training command back at Fort Benning. I need to start over, the right way." I took the box. I didn't say, "I forgive you," because forgiveness is a journey, not a destination, and mine was just beginning. But I looked at him, truly looked at him, and gave a single slow nod, an acknowledgement of his first step on a long, hard road back to honor. The courts had returned full control of the Vance Foundation to me. The new board of directors, all old friends of my grandfather, men of integrity, had formally invited me to assume the chairmanship. The meeting was held in a high-rise office in D.C. that overlooked the Potomac. I looked at these powerful men, at the empty, ornate chair at the head of the table that they had reserved for me, and I shook my head. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But I will not be accepting the position. The Vance Foundation, as it stands, has been tainted by greed and ambition. My grandfather's legacy isn't in these buildings or in the numbers in a bank account." I then laid out my own plan. I would take 15% of the estate to establish a new, smaller foundation, the Vance Honor Fund. It would be a lean, agile organization dedicated to providing direct financial aid and mentorship to enlisted soldiers and NCOs facing hardship, the very people often overlooked by larger charities that focused on officers and high-profile cases. The rest of the estate, I told them, was to be liquidated and divided equally among every legitimate veterans charity in the state of Virginia. The room was silent. One of the old generals, a friend of my grandfather's, looked at me with disbelief. "You're giving away an empire, Command Sergeant Major." I smiled then, a real smile, the first one that had reached my eyes in a long, long time. "No, General," I replied. "I'm not giving it away. I'm planting seeds. My grandfather's legacy was about helping soldiers, not building empires." And that is what I am going to do. I walked out of that boardroom feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. I didn't need their throne. I was going to build my own kingdom, a quiet one, founded on honor and service. I returned to the farm. I stood on the hill where my grandfather and I used to watch for shooting stars. The same hill where he told me I had the heart of a soldier. Dex was there, leaning against an old oak tree, having driven up to check on me. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in shades of soft pink and brilliant gold. "So what's next, Commander?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath of the clean, crisp mountain air. "Next," I said, a sense of profound peace settling over me like a warm blanket. "I think I'll stay here for a while, fix up this old house, get the new fund running, and maybe, for the first time in my life, learn how to just be still." I looked towards the rising sun, feeling its warmth on my face. The war was over, and a new dawn, one of my own making, was just beginning. They left me in the rain when I was 13. They deleted my records, stole my achievements, and called me a disgrace. They thought they had erased their mistake. They were wrong. I wasn't the mistake. I was the lesson. And class was about to be in session. My name is Taryn Blake. 20 years ago, on the night of my 13th birthday, my life as I knew it ended at a gas station off a desolate stretch of highway in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I remember the sound more than anything, the relentless, punishing rhythm of the October rain drumming against the roof of our family's Ford Expedition. It was a sound that matched the cold, hammering silence inside the car. In the driver's seat sat my father, Commander Marcus Blake, his stoic profile illuminated by the sickly green and red glow of the 7-Eleven sign. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands gripping the steering wheel at a perfect 10-2 position, as if he were commanding a battalion and not just his family. He hadn't looked at me, not once, for the last 50 miles. Next to him, my mother, Evelyn, was a statue carved from ice. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, a silent barricade. Her gaze was fixed on the rain-streaked window, watching the drops race each other down the glass as if it were the most fascinating spectacle in the world. Anything to avoid looking at me. In the back, my little sister, Aspen, then 8 years old, was a small, quiet bundle of nerves, sensing the suffocating tension that I couldn't yet name. I smoothed the fabric of my new birthday dress, a simple blue cotton thing my mother had bought me just that morning, back when the day still held the promise of celebration. The fabric felt foreign and foolish now, clinging uncomfortably to my skin in the humid air. A small, hopeful part of my 13-year-old brain wondered if this was it, the surprise. Maybe they'd rented a cabin nearby. Maybe there was a party waiting. Then my father's voice cut through the silence, flat and devoid of any emotion. It was the same voice he used to give orders to his subordinates at Fort Bragg. "Taryn, get out of the car for a minute." The words didn't register at first. I looked from his rigid silhouette to my mother's. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was as if she hadn't heard. "Why?" The question escaped my lips, small and trembling. I hated how weak it sounded. My mother finally turned, her eyes not meeting mine, but landing somewhere on the dashboard. Her voice was thin, brittle. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Taryn. Just do as your father says." That was the moment the hope died. Her words weren't a reassurance. They were a dismissal. I wasn't a daughter in that moment. I was a problem, a difficulty, a thing to be managed. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt. the click echoing in the oppressive quiet. I pushed the heavy door open, and the cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the acrid smell of gasoline and wet asphalt. I stepped out onto the cracked concrete, the rain instantly plastering the thin dress to my body, chilling me to the bone. Before I could fully process what was happening, my father leaned across the passenger seat. In his hand was a crumpled $20 bill. He didn't reach out to hand it to me. He held it out between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something distasteful. "Here," he said, his voice still terrifyingly neutral. "Buy a Coke or something." It wasn't a gift. It wasn't an act of concern. It was a transaction, a final payment, the severance for 13 years of existence. I numbly took the damp bill, my fingers brushing against his. He recoiled instantly. From the back seat, Aspen's small voice piped up, choked with tears. "I want to stay with Taryn." A sharp movement from my mother. She reached back, her hand clamping Nukes over Aspen's mouth, pulling her small body firmly into her side. It was a swift, practiced motion, a clear and final declaration of allegiance. The lines had been drawn, the sides had been chosen. My father's hand disappeared back inside the car, but then reemerged, holding a small folded piece of paper. He pressed it into my palm along with the 20. "We'll be back in 10 minutes, he lied. The door slammed shut, sealing me out. The engine turned over. I stood there, paralyzed under the flickering neon sign, watching the red taillights of the Expedition pull away from the gas pump. I watched them merge onto the highway, their glow shrinking until they were just 2 tiny red pinpricks in the vast black, rain-soaked darkness. Then they were gone. 10 minutes passed, then 20, an hour. The hope I was clinging to, that this was some bizarre, cruel military-style endurance test, that they were just around the corner watching me, began to fray and dissolve in the cold rain. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying hollowness that was blooming in my chest. The gas station clerk, a wiry man with a weathered face and a faded Semper Fi tattoo on his forearm, had been watching me from behind his counter. At first, his expression was one of bored indifference, but as the second hour crept by, it softened into something resembling pity. He came to the door. "You still here, kid? They ain't coming back, are they?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, the motion feeling disconnected from my body. He sighed, a weary, rattling sound, and went back inside. A few minutes later, I saw him on the phone. Through the glass, I could read his lips. "Military police? Yeah, another one." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function. I remembered the piece of paper. With numb fingers, I unfolded the damp, wrinkled square. Scrawled in my father's precise, angular handwriting were the words that would become the foundation of my life. The verdict. "Some soldiers aren't meant for the line. You're better off on your own." There was no love, no regret. It was a field assessment, a final tactical judgment. They hadn't just left me. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had erased me. They had declared me a failure, a faulty piece of equipment, an existence that was no longer tactically viable to the mission of being the Blake family. Standing there, shivering in the relentless October rain, I didn't know it yet, but the war for my own life had just begun. The verdict my father scribbled on that damp piece of paper wasn't written in a moment of anger. It wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of an argument. It was a policy, a doctrine that had been researched, developed, and implemented over years. The gas station wasn't an execution. It was merely the final logistical step in a long, calculated campaign. The evidence was everywhere in our perfectly kept house in Southern Pines. A home that served less as a family dwelling and more as a shrine to my younger sister. I remember one wall in our living room. It was the only wall painted a different color, a deep, commanding navy blue. My father called it the Wall of Honor. It was supposed to be for the family's achievements, but it was really just for Aspen. It was covered in her gleaming swimming medals, her framed honor roll certificates, her ribbons from regional gymnastics meets. Each one was perfectly spaced, polished weekly by my mother. It was Aspen's altar. When I was 11, I won the state-level science fair. It was a project on aerodynamic principles, something I'd spent months on, building gliders out of balsa wood in the garage, filling notebooks with equations. I came home clutching a large blue first-place ribbon and a small trophy. I was buzzing with a pride that felt fragile, desperate for it to be acknowledged. I found my father in his study, reading the Wall Street Journal. I held out the ribbon. "Dad, I won." He glanced up from his paper, his eyes briefly scanning the award before returning to the stock market report. "Good," he said, the word clipped and sterile. He folded his paper with a sharp snap. "That's good, Taryn, but you should know, Aspen just broke the school record for the 50-meter freestyle. Now that's the warrior spirit, pushing physical limits. That's what matters." He walked past me, leaving me standing in the doorway, the blue ribbon suddenly feeling cheap and childish in my hand. My intellectual victory, a testament to months of dedication, was instantly rendered trivial. It wasn't a physical triumph. It wasn't the warrior spirit. It didn't belong on the wall. I quietly took the ribbon to my room and buried it in a shoebox at the back of my closet, where it wouldn't offend the house's primary directive. The invalidation wasn't always so grand. Often, it was in the smaller, more insidious moments. For Aspen's 10th birthday, my parents threw a huge backyard party. All her friends from the swim team and our neighborhood were there. My mother, Evelyn, had ordered a massive sheet cake from the local bakery. When she opened the box, her face tightened into a mask of fury. In bright blue icing, the baker had mistakenly written, "Happy birthday, Taryn." A normal person might have laughed. But to my mother, my very name was an intrusion, a stain on her perfect daughter's perfect day. "For heaven's sake," she muttered, her voice a low, angry hiss. She grabbed a butter knife and frantically began scraping my name off the top of the cake, smearing the white frosting into a grotesque mess. She then took a tube of red icing and clumsily piped Aspen over the wreckage. Such a nuisance. Can't she let her sister have one day? I was standing by the patio door, watching the whole thing. I hadn't said a word. I hadn't done anything. But my existence itself was the problem. My name was the mistake. I was the nuisance. I spent the rest of the party in my room, the sound of happy children outside, feeling like it was from another planet. The final piece of the doctrine revealed itself not in moments of celebration, but in moments of supposed reverence. Every Sunday, we had a formal dinner. My mother would cook a classic Southern meal, fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green bean casserole, and we would sit at the polished dining room table. Before we ate, my father would always say, "Grace." His prayers were like his military briefings, concise, authoritative, and directed at a higher command. One evening, I gathered a sliver of courage. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "can I say grace tonight?" The table fell silent. My father stopped, his fork halfway to his plate. He didn't answer me directly. He slowly lowered his fork and fixed me with a cold, penetrating stare that pinned me to my chair. It was a look that communicated everything. "Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to ask?" After a long, humiliating moment, he broke his gaze and turned to my sister, his expression softening instantly. "Aspen," he said, his voice now warm. "You say it," and she did. As my sister mumbled a simple prayer, I stared down at my plate, a hot wave of shame washing over me. It was the ultimate rejection. In my father's house, under his command, I was not only denied a voice at the table, I was denied a voice to God. I was an unauthorized transmission. That was the night the seed of a new strategy was planted in my mind. The quiet, resentful compliance I had lived with for so long began to harden into something else, something cold and sharp. I realized I could never win their approval. The rules of engagement were rigged, so I would have to leave their battlefield and choose my own. I would apply to West Point, not for him, not to finally earn a spot on his wall of honor, but to build my own fortress, so strong and so undeniable that one day he wouldn't be able to ignore it. I would do it to prove him and his entire doctrine wrong. My father was a strategist. He didn't just remove a piece from the board. He salted the earth where it stood to ensure nothing could grow there again. I learned this the hard way. After the gas station, I was placed with a foster family, a kind older couple named the Hendersons, who gave me a quiet room and the space to heal. In high school, I channeled all my grief and rage into a singular focus. I became a machine of self-improvement. I graduated at the top of my class, was captain of the debate team, and maxed out my physical fitness scores. I did everything by the book, meticulously building a case for myself that no one could deny. My efforts paid off when I secured a coveted letter of recommendation for West Point from our state's own U.S. Senator. I held that letter in my hand, the thick congressional letterhead, feeling like a golden ticket. This was it, my fortress, my way back into the world my father had exiled me from, but on my own terms. The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was thin, impersonal, and devastating. The reason given was vague, a bureaucratic brush-off. Does not meet the requisite leadership profile. It made no sense. My record was flawless. It would be years before I learned the truth, years before I could access the records and connect the dots. I would learn that my father, Commander Marcus Blake, had made a single, unofficial phone call to a former colleague on the admissions board. A quiet word of concern about my unstable history. A subtle, professional assassination. He hadn't just abandoned a child, he had actively, systemically built a wall to ensure I could never climb back into the life I was born for. The front door was permanently barred, so I found the back alley. If the officer corps wouldn't have me, the enlisted ranks would have to. My dream of West Point died, but the fire it had ignited did not. The Hendersons offered to help with college, but I refused. This was my fight. I enrolled in Fayetteville Technical Community College, paying my own way. And that began the grind. My life became a blur of exhausting, repetitive motion. From midnight until 6 in the morning, I was a waitress at a Waffle House, just off I-95. I worked the graveyard shift, pouring endless cups of burnt coffee for long-haul truckers and drunk college kids, my feet aching, my senses dulled by the constant clatter of plates and the smell of stale grease. After my shift, I'd drive to the post gym at Fort Bragg, where I had a job cleaning the weight rooms and locker rooms from 7 to 9. My arms burning as I mopped floors and wiped down equipment, still warm from the morning's soldiers. My classes were from 10 to 2. Then, on weekends, I worked 12-hour shifts at the local Lowe's, stocking shelves and loading bags of concrete into the beds of pickup trucks. the grit of it all a constant presence under my fingernails. I lived on black coffee, cheap instant ramen, and the 4 or 5 hours of broken sleep I could grab on a lumpy hand-me-down sofa. In the slivers of time between work and study, I read. I devoured books on military history, but my greatest solace came from a biography of Alexander Hamilton. I found at a thrift store. I saw myself in his story, the outsider, the orphan, driven by a relentless hunger to prove his worth, to write his way into a legacy. He had risen from nothing. I would rise from less than nothing. There were nights, though, nights when the exhaustion was a physical weight, when a customer at Waffle House would yell at me for a cold cup of coffee, and the fragile armor I had built around myself would crack. I'd sit in my rusty 10-year-old Honda, parked in the farthest corner of the lot, and just stare at the distant, indifferent lights of Fort Bragg. I would ask the silence, is any of this worth it? And in those moments of crushing doubt, my father's face would appear in my mind's eye, his cold, dismissive stare as he turned his back on me, and the bitterness, the rage, would become fuel. It was a toxic energy source, but it burned hot, and it kept me going. My path forward came from an unexpected direction. I enlisted in the Army, aced basic training, and pushed myself to the absolute limit in everything I did. I was disciplined, quiet, and I observed everything. My performance didn't go unnoticed. A Special Forces selection officer, a grizzled master sergeant with eyes that saw everything, pulled me aside one day. "Blake," he said, his voice a low gravel, "you're not like the others. You don't just see the target, you see the whole board. You have a different kind of vision." He told me about a new pilot program, an experimental track designed to identify potential operators from non-traditional backgrounds, including the enlisted ranks. It was a long shot, a backdoor to a world that was almost exclusively the domain of commissioned officers. It was called the Special Forces Assessment and Selection, or SFAS. 24 days of hell in the forests of North Carolina. It was the only door that hadn't been barred by my father's influence. It was my one chance, and I kicked it off its hinges. In the Special Forces, you learn that survival is contingent on trust. You don't just trust your team with your life. You trust them with your six, your flank, your blind spots. For years, I had been my own blind spot monitor. I had operated on the principle that I was entirely, fundamentally alone. But war, and the quiet brotherhood forged within it, has a way of dismantling even the most fortified walls. My first real ally didn't emerge from a shared history, but from a shared crisis. We were on a time-sensitive operation deep in the mountains of the Middle East, a mission predicated on speed and silence. And then our comms went dead. The silence that followed was absolute, a digital void that left my team deaf and isolated. In that critical moment, a new voice, calm and steady, crackled to life over a secondary encrypted channel that wasn't even on my briefing. "Alpha Leader, this is Kilo. I've got eyes for you. Stand by." That voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Kai Kilo Tanaka, a cyber warfare genius who was supposed to be providing remote support from a base hundreds of miles away. Unbeknownst to us, he had anticipated a potential comms blackout and built a redundant private network just for our team. He became our lifeline, guiding us out of the kill zone with quiet, unerring precision. Back at the forward operating base, I sought him out. I found him in a cramped, freezing tent filled with humming servers. Before I could thank him, he handed me a black, unmarked USB drive. "My after-action report," he said, his eyes not leaving his screen. "And I wrote you a personal firewall. more robust than the standard issue. It's on there, just use it, no questions asked. I stood there for a moment, stunned. It wasn't a transaction. He wanted no credit, no formal recognition. It was a simple, unconditional offering of protection from a fellow professional who respected my work. For the first time since I was 13, I felt like someone had my back. That small crack of light widened months later, driven by a nagging suspicion about my past. The official story of my West Point rejection never sat right. It led me to a small rustic log cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains outside Asheville. The cabin belonged to Samuel Sam Tierney, a retired Army records clerk with a legendary, almost supernatural memory. He was a living archive. I sat across from him on his porch, the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air. I didn't give him the story. I just gave him my service number. He closed his eyes for a long moment, a faint smile playing on his lips. He tapped his temple lightly with a gnarled finger. "Blake, Taryn," he murmured. "High aptitude scores, top of your class, Senator's recommendation. You should have been a shoo-in for West Point." He opened his eyes, and they were sharp and clear. "But you weren't. There was a command-level override, highly unusual. Came from a high-level office at the Pentagon. They flagged your file as psychologically unstable. But I remember your psych evaluations and your PT scores. You were anything but unstable." He took a slow sip of his sweet tea. "Someone with a lot of clout wanted you gone, Major, quietly." His words didn't bring anger. They brought a strange, cold clarity. It wasn't my failure. It was my father's design. A stranger, a retired clerk living in the mountains, had just handed me a piece of the truth my own family had spent a lifetime burying. The final piece of this new foundation fell into place on Thanksgiving. For soldiers without family nearby, holidays on base are lonely affairs. I had planned to spend the day in the gym and catching up on reports. But a knock came at the door of my sparse barracks room. It was Kai holding a plate covered in foil. A delicious aroma of roasted turkey and cinnamon wafted from it. "Nobody should eat MREs on Thanksgiving," he said with a small smile. "My wife made way too much." He didn't just give me the plate, he invited me to his home. A small, unassuming house in a Fayetteville suburb, filled with the happy chaos of 2 young children and the warm scent of a real, home-cooked meal. I sat at their table between his son and daughter, and for the first time in 2 decades, I experienced a holiday dinner without feeling like an unwanted guest. There was no judgment, no comparison, no tense silence, just laughter, stories, and the simple, profound warmth of acceptance. As I helped Kai's wife clear the plates, I looked around at this small, noisy, loving world. I had spent a lifetime trying to get back into a family that had thrown me away. I realized that night I had just found a new one. For years, I had operated on the principle of avoidance. I had built a life, a career, and a fortress of self-reliance in the shadows, far from the gravitational pull of my family. But my recent appearance at the Defense Strategy Summit had put me on their radar. A ghost had stepped into the light, and now the hunters were stirring. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. The caller ID read Evelyn Blake. It was the first time I had seen that name on my screen in over a decade. A younger version of me might have felt a flutter of hope, but the woman I had become, the analyst trained to detect threats, felt only the cold prickle of an imminent attack. I answered, "This is Blake." "Taryn, darling." Her voice was a confection of artificial sweetness, a tone she reserved for officers' wives and the pastor's wife. "We saw you on C-SPAN. My goodness, a major! Your father and I are just bursting with pride. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air, hollow and weightless. Pride was a commodity in my family, only granted when it could be reflected back onto the source. We were thinking, she continued, undeterred by my silence. You must come for dinner this weekend, a real celebration. It's been too long. I thought of a verse my foster mother, Mrs. Henderson, used to quote from the Bible. Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. This wasn't an olive branch, it was a summons. A reconnaissance mission on their part to assess the threat I now posed. I'll be there, I said, my voice as neutral as my father's had been on that rainy night. I agreed, not out of a need for reconciliation, but out of a need for intelligence. It was time to conduct my own reconnaissance. Driving up to the house in Southern Pines felt like infiltrating an enemy compound. It was exactly as I remembered, perfectly manicured lawn, an American flag flying crisply from the porch, and an overwhelming sense of sterile order. Inside, the shrine to Aspen had only grown more elaborate. Her officer candidate school graduation photo held a place of honor over the mantel. There were signed photos of her with various generals, awards from TRADOC, the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Of my 20 years in the service, of the Green Beret on my head, there was not a single trace. I did not exist here. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The air was thick with unspoken tension, masked by my mother's forced smiles and my father's authoritative pronouncements on global affairs. He didn't ask how I was. He conducted a debriefing. So, Taryn, he began, cutting into his roast beef with surgical precision. And what are your current activities? The word was loaded, a professional inquiry designed to feel like a personal one, a way to gauge my access and influence. They're classified, sir, I replied, using the title deliberately. My mother jumped in, redirecting the spotlight. Oh, you'll never guess what Aspen has been up to. She just received another commendation from TRADOC for an absolutely brilliant paper on strategic theory. She has her father's mind for it, you know. The words were a pinpoint strike, delivered with a proud smile. She knew, and my father knew, that strategic theory was my field. It was my passion, the very subject I had excelled at before they had me erased. The final act came with dessert, a key lime pie, served with a side of neighborly intrusion. They had invited the Harts from next door, an elderly couple who served as an unwitting audience. Marcus, Evelyn, it's just so wonderful, Mrs. Hart gushed, to have both of your girls serving our country. 2 Green Berets in one family. What are the odds? This was the moment, the opening. The entire evening had been a series of tactical feints, and now they had made a mistake. They had brought in an outside observer who had just presented a false premise. I set my dessert fork down on the china plate with a soft click. The small sound seemed to silence the room. I looked across the table, my eyes locking onto Aspen's. Her smile faltered. Thank you, Mrs. Hart, I said, my voice clear and cold, cutting through the warm domestic air. But there's a small distinction. One of us earned her Green Beret by completing the Special Forces Assessment and Selection. The other was issued one for her desk job at TRADOC. The silence that followed was absolute. In the culture we came from, this wasn't just an insult. It was a charge of heresy. It was the difference between a warrior and a bureaucrat, between a trial by fire and a line item on a form. I had publicly challenged the legitimacy of their golden child's most prized credential. I saw the flash of fury in my father's eyes. The blood drained from my mother's face. Aspen just stared, her mouth slightly agape. The lie she had lived with now, exposed under the bright dining room lights. I stood up. "Thank you for dinner," I said to no one in particular. It was very informative. The game had begun, and I had just made the opening move. In chess, when you challenge a king, you don't expect him to abdicate. You expect him to use every piece on the board to destroy you. My father was a master of the game. I had made a move at the dinner table, a calculated strike against his queen. I knew retaliation was coming. I just didn't expect it to be so swift or so cowardly. The first countermove came 3 days later. My phone rang. It was Kai. His voice was as calm as it had been over the radio in the mountains of Afghanistan. But underneath it, I could detect a tightly coiled wire of tension. "Taryn," he said, his voice low, "we have visitors." "What kind of visitors, Kilo?" "The official kind. 2 special agents from CID are at my house right now. In my living room, with my wife and kids." A cold dread snaked its way up my spine. CID, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. "On what grounds?" I asked, my own voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're investigating an anonymous tip," he said, the cynical quote marks audible in his tone. "Something about the misuse of government property for personal projects, and a second allegation of an inappropriate relationship with a superior officer, namely you." I closed my eyes. It was a classic Marcus Blake maneuver, surgical, brutal, and executed through proxies. He couldn't attack me directly through official channels. My record was too clean. So he attacked my foundation. He targeted the only person who had shown me unconditional loyalty, threatening his career, his family, his honor. He was trying to isolate me again, just as he had done 20 years ago. "They're trying to break us apart, Taryn." Kai's voice was steady, a rock in the storm. "Don't let them." "I won't," I promised, my hand tightening on the phone. "Stay strong." But the second attack was already on its way. That same afternoon, a plain manila envelope with no return address appeared in my on-base mailbox. My name and box number were typed, impersonal. Inside there was no letter, just a single sheet of paper, a printout of a recent article from the Army Times about the increasing role of women in special operations. Scrawled all over the margins in a familiar, elegant, yet spidery cursive were hateful, venomous words. The ink was a vicious purple. "Whore." "Slept her way to the top." "Disgrace to the Blake name." I didn't need a handwriting analyst. I knew that script better than my own. It was my mother's. The same hand that had once signed my permission slips and birthday cards was now being used to scrawl misogynistic poison. This was her front in the war. While my father wielded the institutional power of the U.S. Army, my mother engaged in the shiv-in-the-ribs tactics of anonymous slander. It was a coward's attack, a poisoned dart fired from the safety of the shadows. This wasn't just denial anymore. This was a curse, a deliberate, hateful attempt to obliterate my character, to reduce my 2 decades of sacrifice and achievement to a series of vile, sexist tropes. That night, I stood in the darkness of my office on Fort Bragg, the single sheet of paper lying on my desk under the stark glow of a lamp. It looked like a piece of contaminated evidence from a crime scene. I stared out the window at the familiar lights of the base, the place that had become more of a home to me than the house I grew up in. The anger I had kept on a tight leash for 20 years, the cold, disciplined fury that had fueled my every step, finally broke free. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was a glacial shift, a tectonic plate of my soul that had been under immense pressure for 2 decades finally fractured, and in its place rose a mountain of cold, diamond-hard resolve. I'm sure you know the feeling. It's that moment when the line is crossed, not just for you, but for the people you care about. It's the moment you realize that playing defense, that just surviving, is no longer enough. It's the moment you stop protecting yourself from the pain, and you decide to become the pain. It's a terrifying moment, but it's also the most clarifying moment in the world. You finally know exactly what you have to do. They had come after my team, my chosen family. They had attacked my honor. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had burned the bridge, and I was now free to burn their kingdom to the ground. My movements were swift and precise. I picked up my secure phone. I dialed Kai's number. He answered on the first ring. "Kilo," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth, any hesitation. It was the voice of a commander giving a final, irrevocable order. "It's time. Decrypt every file. Pull every piece of data we have. We're not on defense anymore." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. "We're going on the attack." It wasn't a decision made in anger. It was a declaration of war. They wanted to erase me. I was about to show them what true erasure looked like. My declaration of war to Kai was not a command born of impulse. It was the authorization to execute a plan I had been quietly assembling for years. My father had taught me that battles are won long before the first shot is fired. They are won in the preparation, in the meticulous gathering of intelligence, and in the quiet forging of superior weapons. Our war room was a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility deep in the bowels of a nondescript building on Fort Bragg. No windows, soundproofed walls, and enough encrypted server power to run a small country. For the next 72 hours, fueled by black coffee and a cold, shared fury, Kai and I went to work. This wasn't about revenge, it was about forensics. It was about building a case so airtight, so rooted in objective data, that it would be irrefutable. The first weapon we sharpened was linguistics. For years, Aspen had been hailed as a strategic prodigy within TRADOC, publishing influential papers on modern warfare. I had provided Kai with my old hard drives, containing years of personal notes, mission drafts, and unpublished theoretical papers. He ran a proprietary stylistic analysis algorithm, a program he had designed himself that could identify an author's linguistic fingerprint, their unique patterns of syntax, vocabulary, and sentence structure. He set the program to compare Aspen's published work against my private files. We watched in silence as the progress bar crept across the screen. Then, the results populated. A single number glowed in the center of the monitor, 94.7% correlation. Kai let out a low whistle. "My God, Taryn," he whispered, his eyes wide. "She didn't just steal your ideas. She copy-pasted your entire mind. She built her whole career on your intellectual labor." I stared at the screen, my face a mask of stone. There was no surprise, only a grim, final confirmation. I hadn't just been erased, I had been recycled. My work, my thoughts, my voice, stolen, repackaged under my sister's name, and celebrated by the very system that had cast me out. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into their final, damning positions. The next step was to plant the evidence where it would do the most good. A direct complaint to the Inspector General's office would be seen as a personal grievance, a case of sibling rivalry. It could be dismissed. I needed a more elegant solution. I needed the system to investigate itself. I had Kai grant me temporary untraceable access to the Army's high-level administrative networks, the CyPAR-Net portals that connect the entire command structure. From there, I moved like a ghost through the digital archives. I didn't alter any files. I didn't delete anything. I simply left what we in the Intel community call digital breadcrumbs. On several of Aspen's award recommendations, the official DA Form 638s, I embedded a hidden query tag in the metadata, visible only to high-level system auditors. The tag was simple: cross-reference authorship with AAR Operation Nightfall. Operation Nightfall was a classified mission I had led, a mission whose success had been officially credited to another unit. On her published papers, I attached another flag: Verify Approval Chain for Document ID 77 Alpha. These weren't accusations. They were quiet professional questions planted deep within the machine. They were tripwires designed to be triggered not by me, but by any diligent investigator following procedure. I was arming the system to attack its own corruption. But the final weapon was the master stroke. It was a failsafe I had built years ago during a system architecture contract at the Pentagon. A piece of code I had buried deep in the Army's intellectual property management software. It was a secret subroutine I had named the Cerberus Protocol. Cerberus, the mythical three-headed hound that guarded the gates of the underworld, was the perfect name. My protocol was designed to be a silent guardian. When activated, it would autonomously run a deep-level audit, cross-referencing authorship credentials, security clearances, and command approval chains across the entire network. It was designed to hunt for inconsistencies, forgeries, and unauthorized overrides, all the things my father had used to erase me and elevate my sister. It was a truth machine, and for years it had been dormant, waiting. That night, alone in the humming silence of the skiff, I logged into a secure terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, entering a long, complex authorization key. A final prompt appeared on the black screen, blinking patiently. Execute Cerberus Protocol? YN. I pressed Y. I hit Enter. The screen went blank for a second, then 3 simple words appeared in stark white text: Cerberus is awake. I leaned back in my chair. It was done. I had unleashed the hound. I knew that within the next 24 hours, its digital howls would begin to echo through the servers of TRADOC, the Inspector General's office, and eventually the highest echelons of the Pentagon. The machine was now hunting itself, and I knew exactly what it would find. The Cerberus Protocol worked faster than I had anticipated. A silent, efficient hound, it sniffed out the digital rot and began sending up flares. Within days, a quiet panic was rippling through the command structure at TRADOC. Internal audits were triggered, files were flagged, questions were being asked in hushed, urgent tones. My father, I knew, would feel the tremors. And like any cornered strategist, he made a critical error. He overplayed his hand. In an attempt to control the narrative and publicly revalidate his prized asset, he pulled strings to have Captain Aspen Blake named as a last-minute speaker at the prestigious Joint Chiefs of Staff Symposium on Military Ethics, held at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. The topic was integrity in modern doctrine. It was a bold, arrogant move designed to place Aspen on the ultimate pedestal of intellectual and moral authority. What he didn't know was that the symposium's organizing committee, a panel of senior officers, had already received a discreet, high-level alert from the Inspector General's office. The alert was a result of the digital breadcrumbs I had left. It didn't make accusations, it simply noted, significant authorship and attribution discrepancies concerning the work of Captain Blake, and suggested that another subject matter expert, Major Taryn Blake, be consulted. My father had unwittingly set the stage. The committee simply added a second act. I received the official invitation via a secure email. I accepted without hesitation. The auditorium was a sea of dress uniforms, a collection of the most powerful military minds in the nation. I sat in the back, an anonymous major in the crowd, and watched as my sister took the stage. I saw my parents in the front row, beaming, my father, a portrait of command and paternal pride. My mother, elegant and poised, the perfect supportive wife. Aspen began her speech. To her credit, she was a polished presenter. She spoke eloquently about integrity, about the moral duty of strategic planners, about the sacred trust of authorship. She delivered the words I had written in lonely barracks rooms and dusty forward operating bases with a smooth, practiced confidence. She was brilliant. She was a fraud. When she finished, the applause was warm and respectful. She smiled, basking in it. The moderator, a 4-star Air Force general, stepped to the podium. "Thank you, Captain Blake, for those insightful remarks," he said. "And now, to provide an additional operational perspective on this very doctrine, the committee has invited another expert. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major Taryn Blake, United States Army Special Forces." A ripple of confusion went through the audience. I saw my father's back go ramrod straight. My mother's smile froze on her face, a grotesque mask of shock. Aspen, still on the stage, looked out at the crowd, her eyes wide with dawning horror, as I stood up from my seat in the back and began to walk down the aisle. The walk felt like a mile. Every eye was on me. I could feel my father's gaze like a physical weight, a desperate silent command for me to stop, to turn back, to disappear, as I had been trained to do. I ignored it. I reached the stage and nodded to the moderator. I turned to the podium, adjusting the microphone. I looked out at the faces staring back at me, generals, admirals, colonels, and in the front row, my family, my creators and my betrayers. I carried no notes. I needed none. "Good morning," I began, my voice calm and steady, amplified by the hall's speakers. "Captain Blake speaks with great eloquence on the theory of strategic integrity. I'd like to speak briefly on its application, because theory, ladies and gentlemen, does not exist in a vacuum. It is born of experience. It is forged in the field, paid for in sweat, and sometimes in blood." On the large screen behind me, a slide appeared. On the left was a key paragraph from Aspen's award-winning paper. On the right was an excerpt from a classified after-action report from Operation Nightfall. The wording was nearly identical. "On the left," I continued, my voice even, "we have a theoretical concept. On the right, we have the lesson learned after a 12-hour firefight that cost us 2 wounded men. One is an academic exercise, the other is a scar." I clicked to the next slide, and the next, each one a stark side-by-side comparison. The evidence was overwhelming, clinical, and undeniable. The room was utterly silent. I could see Aspen shrinking, her face pale, her polished confidence shattered. My father looked like he had been turned to stone. I advanced to my final slide. It was blank. I turned my full attention to the audience, my eyes finally settling on my father. "In the United States Army, we have a core belief that rank and honor must be earned. They are not to be issued, they are not to be appropriated, and they are not to be inherited." I let those words sink in, a direct echo of the challenge I had laid down at the dinner table. The ethical question, before us today is not just about plagiarism. It is about the very soul of our meritocracy. What happens to our institution, to our integrity, when a system allows inheritance to replace merit? I looked at my father, at my mother, at my sister. The unmasking was complete. I had not raised my voice. I had not made a single accusation. I had simply presented the data. The data did not lie. The silence that answered my question was more explosive than any cannon fire. The aftermath of my presentation at the symposium was not a fiery explosion, but a series of controlled demolitions. The truth, once spoken aloud on such a stage, took on a life of its own. I didn't need to push anymore. The system, in its slow, bureaucratic way, began to grind forward, and I simply stepped back to watch the consequences unfold. My phone, however, became a battlefield. For 2 days straight, it was a relentless barrage. The first calls were from my father. They weren't apologies, they were furious, bellowed commands. He accused me of insubordination, of treason against the family, of destroying everything he had ever built. His rage was that of a deposed king, incredulous that a mere pawn could have toppled his board. Then came the calls from my mother. These were worse. They were tearful, manipulative monologues, filled with accusations of how I had broken her heart, how I had humiliated them, how I had ruined Aspen's life. Her words were a torrent of guilt, a desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground. She never once acknowledged the truth. To her, my crime wasn't the lie she and my father had constructed. It was that I had dared to expose it. I listened to the first few voicemails, my face impassive. Then, with a calm that felt like it had been earned over 2 decades of war, both foreign and domestic, I went into my contacts. I found Marcus Blake. I pressed block. I found Evelyn Blake. I pressed block. It was that simple. There was no final dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, just a quiet, digital severing. My silence was no longer the silence of a wounded child enduring pain. It was the impenetrable wall of a fortress whose gates were now permanently closed. I owed them nothing, not an explanation, not an argument, not even my anger. The game was over. I had won. A week later, I found Aspen waiting for me at a deserted departure gate at Reagan National Airport. The arrogant, confident captain was gone. In her place was a young woman who looked lost and utterly defeated, her uniform seeming to hang off a frame that had shrunk. "You burned it all down," she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears welled in her eyes. "You burned everything to the ground." I looked at my sister, and for the first time I didn't feel anger or resentment. I felt a profound, weary pity. She had been the golden child, but she had also been a prisoner, trapped in a role she was terrified to fail. "No, Aspen," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I didn't burn anything down. I just opened a window and let the light in. You've been choosing to live in the dark for a very long time." The dam broke. She sobbed, a raw, painful sound. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I was just so scared. I was always so scared of disappointing him, of not being what he wanted." I let her cry for a moment. A pastor I once knew used to say that sometimes loving someone means loving them from a distance. I knew I could never be a true sister to her in the way most people understood it. But in that moment, I could be her commanding officer. I could give her a new mission. "Then it's time to start learning how to earn something for yourself," I said. "Request a hard posting, something difficult, somewhere no one knows the name Blake. Go there and learn what it feels like to build something that's truly your own. That's the only way forward for you." The official fallout was swift and quiet, exactly as the Army prefers. To avoid a public scandal, my father was allowed to request an early retirement, which was immediately granted. He was gone from the Pentagon within a month. Aspen, after a formal investigation by the Inspector General, accepted non-judicial punishment under Article 15. She received a formal letter of reprimand in her file and was permanently passed over for any future promotion. It was a career-ending blow, but it allowed her to remain in the service, to have the chance to start over, honestly. The final piece of correspondence arrived in my own inbox a month later. It was a formal notification from the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. It stated that all publications previously authored by Captain Aspen Blake were being officially retracted. They would be reviewed, properly attributed, and reissued under a new designation. The designation was the Blake Doctrine. It wasn't a loud victory, it was the quiet, satisfying click of a universe righting itself. It was the simple, undeniable correction of the record. You know, it's a strange thing. Winning a war you've been fighting your whole life. You expect to feel pure joy, a soaring sense of triumph. And part of you does, but another part of you just feels quiet. You feel the weight of the armor you've been carrying for so long, finally coming off your shoulders, and you realize how heavy it was. You're not just celebrating a victory, you're mourning the battle you should never have had to fight. It's the complicated, bittersweet peace that comes with finally setting down a burden. A peace that, I think, only those of us who have carried it can truly understand. A year after the symposium, I found myself driving through the familiar pine woods of Southern Pines. My foster mother, Mrs. Henderson, had passed away peacefully, and I had returned to help clear out a few of my old belongings from her attic. On my way out of town, my route took me past the house I grew up in, the Blake house. I slowed the car, not out of longing, but out of a detached, clinical curiosity. It looked smaller than I remembered. The lawn was still perfect, the flag still flew from the porch, but the house itself seemed quiet, subdued. A car I didn't recognize was parked in the driveway. I felt a flicker of nothing. No anger, no sadness, no triumph. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger's home from a history book. The emotional anchor that had moored me to that place for so long had been pulled up. The connection was severed. I pressed my foot on the gas and drove on, feeling only the quiet, profound lightness of being untethered. My life now resided back at Fort Bragg, but in a new capacity. I had accepted a position as a senior instructor at the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. It was here, at the heart of the Special Forces world, that I found my true purpose, forging the next generation of operators. My students, a mix of young, brilliant, and impossibly tough candidates, had nicknamed me the Cerberus Master, a title I accepted with a quiet smile. They didn't know the full story, but they understood that my doctrines were built not just on theory, but on the hard-won lessons of survival. On my 34th birthday, a small, unexpected package arrived at my office. There was no sender's name on the label, only a customs declaration from an APO address in Africa. Inside, nestled in packing peanuts, was a small carrot cake, my favorite dessert as a child, a detail I thought everyone had forgotten. A simple card was tucked beside it. On it were just 3 words, written in a careful, deliberate hand: Major, Sister, Strategist. I knew instantly it was from Aspen. She was serving out her quiet penitence at a remote outpost in the Sahel. earning her place one dusty, grueling day at a time. The 3 words were more than a birthday wish. They were an acknowledgement, a confession, a treaty. They were the first truly honest words that had ever passed between us. She was finally seeing me for all the things I was, not just the thing they had wanted me to be. That evening, I didn't celebrate alone. I had invited my new team, a few fellow instructors and a handful of my sharpest students, to a cookout at the small house I had bought just outside of Post. The air in my backyard was filled with the scent of grilling steaks and the sound of easy laughter as these young soldiers debated tactics and told war stories. Kai was there, manning the grill. He handed me a cold bottle of beer, clinking it against mine. "Not a bad legacy, Major," he said, nodding toward the group of bright-eyed candidates who were listening to one of my stories with rapt attention. "Not bad at all." I smiled, a real smile, one that reached my eyes. "No, Kilo," I said. "Not bad at all." Later that night, after everyone had left and a peaceful quiet had settled over the house, I walked into my living room. The room was simple, comfortable. On a bookshelf against the wall, I had cleared a space. It wasn't for medals or framed commendations. My past achievements were filed away. They had served their purpose. I picked up a new picture frame from the mantel. It held a photo taken just last week of me standing with my current class of Green Beret candidates. We were all dusty, exhausted, and grinning after a grueling field exercise. I looked at the faces in the photo, the future of the force, the men and women I had the privilege to teach and to learn from, my team, my family. I placed the frame on the empty shelf. It was the only trophy I needed. The long, silent war was over. I had fought for my name, for my honor, for the truth of my existence. But the final victory wasn't the retribution I had won. It was the peace I had built in its place. I had not only reclaimed my past, I had constructed a future, one of my own design, built on a foundation of undeniable truth and quiet, hard-earned joy. At my own brother's award ceremony, my father, a 3-star general, walked past me and whispered to his aide, "Seat her with the catering staff. A ghost shouldn't be haunting the main hall." 10 years of my sacrifice, dismissed like trash. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that this ghost was about to start a war. My name is Shelby Grant. I'm 35 years old, and for the last 10 of those years I have been a ghost. Tonight, my haunting ground was the hallowed home of the commandants, the Marine barracks at 8th and I in Washington, D.C. The crisp October air hung heavy with the scent of polished mahogany and floor wax, a fragrance so deeply embedded in my memory it ached. It was the smell of my childhood, of my past, of a life that no longer belonged to me. I stood in the grand hall, a solitary figure in a charcoal gray business dress, a safe, deliberately forgettable choice. I was a patch of muted color in a sea of immaculate dress blues, the deep navy and brilliant red a stark reminder of the world I had lost. My eyes were fixed on my father, Lieutenant General Harrison Vance. He was the sun around which this entire universe revolved, and tonight he was beaming as he clasped my younger brother, Kalen, in a proud, firm embrace. Kalen, freshly minted as a captain, looked every bit the golden sun, his metal gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. I could feel the familiar weight of gazes from across the room. There were the pitying glances from a few old colleagues, their eyes soft with a sorrow I didn't want. And then there were the others, the quick, deliberate turning of heads, the sudden interest in a painting on the wall. My presence was a breach of protocol, a social misstep. I was a dissonant note in the perfect, martial symphony of the Vance family. The formal invitation, sent from a low-level administrative office with my name misspelled as Shelley, had made that clear enough. Then my father began to move through the crowd, his aide-de-camp trailing a respectful pace behind. He approached my position near the gilded archway, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he might look at me. He didn't. His gaze slid right past me, as if I were nothing more than a part of the decor. As he passed, he leaned slightly toward the young officer at his side. His voice was a low, controlled whisper, not meant for the room, but sharp enough to slice through the polite chatter and find its mark in me. "Seat her with the catering staff," he murmured, the words precise and cold. "A ghost shouldn't be haunting the main hall." Each syllable was a shard of ice lodging itself in my chest. There were no tears. The rage I expected to feel didn't come. There was only a profound, hollowing cold, a chilling void that confirmed what I had long suspected. I had been officially, irrevocably erased from their story. I wasn't an enemy to be fought, I was an inconvenience to be hidden. My eyes drifted to a small, solitary table tucked into a dim alcove, pressed against the swinging door that led to the kitchen. On it sat a single, pristine white place card. Even from a distance, I knew what it would say. I walked over, my movements stiff. There it was, Shelley Grant. A final petty insult. I was not just a ghost, I was a misnamed one. Later, Kalen stood at the podium, bathed in the warm spotlight. His voice, so much like our father's, filled the hall. He thanked everyone. He praised our father, who had taught him about strength. He honored our stepmother, Seraphina, who had taught him about grace. Each name was an affirmation, a brick laid in the foundation of his perfect world. But the name Shelby Grant, the name of the sister who had taught him how to tie the knots in his first pair of combat boots, who had spent hours drilling him on how to read a topographical map until he could do it in his sleep. That name was never spoken. His eyes swept the room, and for a single, fleeting moment, they met mine. He gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod, the kind you give a stranger in a grocery aisle, before his gaze moved on. That willful forgetting, that public omission in front of the very men and women who had once been my world, was more brutal than any verbal condemnation. In that moment of profound humiliation, my mother's voice echoed in my mind, a memory from a sunlit afternoon, reading from her worn Bible. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." I had decided to simply vanish, to give them the one thing they so clearly wanted from me. I turned toward the exit, ready to slip out into the anonymity of the DC night. "Major Grant." The voice was deep, resonant with an authority that cut through my haze of shame. My training, dormant but never gone, snapped me to attention. I turned. Standing there was General Thaddeus Ironclad Thorne, a living legend in the Corps, a man whose stare was said to have made colonels weak in the knees. He gestured with his head, leading me away from the crowd and into a quiet, marble-tiled corridor that felt as cold as a tomb. "They want you silent, Shelby," he said, his eyes sharp as a bayonet's tip, seeming to see every crack in my carefully constructed facade. "But the Corps doesn't forget its warriors." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a metal card. It was black, heavy, and cool to the touch. In the center, a single word was etched in stark silver letters: Sentinel. He pressed it into my palm. "This isn't forgiveness, Major," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. It's a weapon. You decide if you want to use it. The card was cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the sudden, unfamiliar spark that ignited deep within my chest. It was the first warmth I had felt in a decade. Back in my small rented apartment in Arlington, Virginia, the metal card felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Sentinel. A weapon, General Thorne had called it. My gaze fell upon an old footlocker tucked in the corner, a dusty relic I hadn't opened in years. With a deep breath, I knelt and unlatched the rusty clasps. The lid creaked open, releasing a ghost. It wasn't a spirit, but a smell, the dry, acrid scent of Afghan dust and cordite, a perfume of violence and regret. The smooth, cool metal of the sentinel card in my hand seemed to dissolve, its image replaced by another piece of metal I could never forget. The blood-streaked dog tag of Sergeant Maya Jimenez. The memory didn't arrive like a film. It descended like a sandstorm, blinding and absolute. Fob Sangin, Helmand Province, 2016. The sun was a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. My unit was on a reconnaissance mission, deep in the green zone. Intel was wrong, fatally wrong. We weren't walking toward a weapons cache. We were walking into a kill box. The first crack of an AK-47 ripped through the oppressive heat, followed by a symphony of chaos. The air filled with the snap of incoming rounds and the panicked shouts of my Marines. Through the static of my radio, the command from HQ was a furious roar. Break contact. I repeat, break contact and withdraw immediately. It was the voice of logic, of protocol, of the rules of engagement we had drilled 1,000 times. It was the voice I was sworn to obey. But then I saw her. Through the swirling dust and the terrifying muzzle flashes, I saw a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, standing frozen in a small, exposed patch of dirt between two crumbling mud brick compounds. Her dress was a collection of faded rags, her small face a mask of dirt and tears. She was wounded, a dark stain spreading on her leg. She was terrified. The order was to pull back. Every fiber of my being as a Marine officer screamed to obey. But the heart of a human being, the heart of a big sister who once bandaged her own brother's scraped knees, screamed a different command. I have a visual on a child, wounded civilian, I yelled into my handset. Sergeant Maya Sparky Jimenez, my right hand, my best friend, her voice strained with urgency, screamed back, "Shelby, no, it's a trap. It's a goddamn trap." But I had already broken formation. I was moving. It was pure instinct, a reckless, compassionate impulse. I sprinted across the open ground, the world narrowing to a tunnel, focused only on that small, trembling figure. I scooped her into my arms, her tiny body, shockingly light, and scrambled for the cover of a low wall. I could hear Maya and the rest of my team laying down suppressing fire, covering my insane maneuver. When the firefight finally subsided, when the terrifying roar was replaced by an even more terrifying silence, I made my way back to the rally point, the little girl clinging to me. Maya wasn't there. They found her body an hour later. She had been moving to a better position to cover my retreat when she'd spotted it, a pressure plate IED right next to where she'd taken cover. She had been too close to disarm it, too close to run. She'd been a brilliant Marine, a friend who deserved a long life, filled with laughter and cheap beer and letters home to her mother. And she was gone because of me. The next thing I knew, I was staring at a sterile white ceiling. The sharp, antiseptic smell of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany filled my nostrils, a smell meant to signify healing that only felt like judgment. My arm was in a cast, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. My father was standing by the bed. He wasn't holding my hand. He wasn't offering a comforting word. He was holding my career in his hands, and he was about to crush it. "You let your emotions compromise your judgment," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth, as cold and impersonal as the official report he was no doubt already drafting in his head. "You sacrificed a United States Marine for an anonymous native child. She was your responsibility, Shelby, and you failed." He never asked if I was okay. He never asked what I had seen, what I had felt. He just looked at me, not as his daughter, but as a tactical error, a stain on the immaculate legacy of the Vance name. In the haze of my medication, all I could do was whisper Maya's name over and over. It was a prayer. It was a confession. "Your career in this corps is over," he declared, his words a final, clean execution. And those were the last meaningful words we ever spoke to each other. There was no court-martial. That would have been too loud, too messy. It would have invited questions. Instead, they handed me a quiet, clinical severance, an honorable discharge for medical reasons. Post-traumatic stress disorder. It was the perfect, polite way to bury a career and the inconvenient truth along with it. The first after-action report, filed by a young lieutenant in my platoon, had praised my actions, noting I'd saved a child, and that Maya's death was a tragic consequence of a complex engagement. That report mysteriously vanished, replaced by an official version that painted me as an impulsive, emotional officer who had needlessly endangered her unit. My official record was sealed. My story was rewritten. I became a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of Quantico, a lesson on the price of acting on your feelings. The grief of losing Maya and the crushing weight of my guilt became the iron bars of a prison I willingly locked myself inside for 10 long years. My father had handed me the shovel, and with my own 2 hands I had dug my own grave, burying myself in silence and shame, until tonight. Tonight, someone had handed me a weapon. After Landstuhl, I didn't go back to Virginia. I couldn't. I couldn't face the whispers, the pitying looks from neighbors, or the suffocating silence of my family home. Instead, I ran. I ended up in a nameless city in the heart of the Midwest, renting a cramped, drafty loft apartment above a series of shuttered storefronts. The first few months were a blur, a foggy haze of cheap whiskey and nightmares that smelled of dust and cordite. I was adrift. Then one morning I caught my reflection in the grimy bathroom mirror, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders slumped in defeat. That wasn't Major Shelby Grant. That wasn't a Marine. A memory surfaced, something I'd seen scrolling endlessly on YouTube one night. A former Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, his voice a low growl saying, "Discipline equals freedom." The phrase hit me like a splash of cold water. Discipline. That was a language I understood. That day I poured the rest of the whiskey down the drain, laced up a pair of old running shoes, and began the war to reclaim myself, one grueling mile at a time, in absolute, unforgiving silence. I knew I needed a new kind of weapon, a new battlefield where my past didn't matter. So I turned to the digital world. I enrolled in online courses for cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, trading my rifle for a keyboard. The long nights were now spent battling complex lines of code instead of tangible enemies. My small living room became a war room, the walls covered not with maps of Helmand, but with printouts of network diagrams and machine learning algorithms. To pay the bills, I worked 2 jobs. By day, I was a low-level security guard at a bland tech firm, the quiet woman who checked ID badges with a polite nod. By night, I was a bartender at a local dive, slinging beers and wiping down sticky counters. No one knew that the woman serving them a Bud Light could architect a sophisticated cyber attack. The anonymity was my camouflage. It was in that obscurity, that complete lack of expectation, that I began to reforge myself. 1 month, a letter from the Military Retirement Fund arrived. Tucked inside was a handwritten sticky note from one of my father's former office clerks. The general hopes you're finding a peaceful life and staying out of trouble. It wasn't concern, it was a warning, a reminder that I was still being watched, that my peaceful life was conditional. The rage it sparked became fuel for another sleepless night of study. It was on a deep web forum, a digital speakeasy for cybersecurity professionals, that I first encountered Echo. He was a ghost in the machine, a brilliant hacker who breached 3 layers of my experimental firewall with elegant, almost contemptuous ease. But I stopped him at the 4th layer. I trapped him using a piece of code I'd designed based on a layered defensive strategy from my old Marine Corps playbook. Instead of retaliating, a private message appeared on my screen. Your code, it has discipline, like a soldier. We started talking, cautiously at first. I was Ghost, he was Echo. I learned his real name was Echo Faraday, a former NSA prodigy who'd walked away from the agency over ethical disagreements. He never asked about my past, never pressed for details beyond what I was willing to share. He didn't need to. He saw me in the clean, logical structure of my code, in the relentless way I pursued a problem. For the first time in years, I felt seen for who I was, not for who I had failed to be. The metal card from General Thorne had sat in a drawer for 7 years, a cold, unanswered question. But now I was ready. With Echo's help, I made contact through the clandestine channel. Sentinel wasn't just a defense system. It was my philosophy, my penance, and my purpose. We designed an AI that could predict threats before they materialized, a system to save soldiers like Maya, to prevent commanders like me from ever having to make an impossible choice between a mission and a life. In a secure, hidden facility back in Arlington, funded by Thorne's quiet network, I became the chief architect. I was Ghost, the commander of a silent digital army. I had taken the shrapnel of my past and forged it into a firewall. I had channeled my grief and anger into algorithms of protection. Sentinel was my legacy, built from the ashes of a life I'd been forced to leave behind. Life at Sentinel had become a rhythm of logic and order, a world governed by data streams and threat assessments. It was clean, precise, and devoid of messy human emotions. Then one Saturday, while cleaning out a closet in my Arlington apartment, I found it. It was a small cedar box, and the moment I saw it, the sterile, air-conditioned world of my present life receded. My mother, Lillian, had given it to me just before she died of cancer. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a well-worn book of Mary Oliver poems and an old brass compass. A memory, warm and vivid, washed over me. I was a teenager again, sitting with my mother in her sprawling garden at our old house in rural Virginia. The air was thick with the scent of roses and damp earth. She had pressed the compass into my hand. "This compass will always point north, Shelby," she'd said, her voice gentle. "But only your heart can tell you where home is." My father's cruelest lie echoed in my ears. His claim that in her final days, my mother had been disappointed in my rebellious spirit. that she'd changed her will to leave everything to Kaylin, the more deserving child. For years, that lie had been a festering wound, a final rejection from the one person whose love had been my anchor. But it didn't fit. It didn't square with the woman who gave me a compass for my heart, who read me poetry about the wildness of nature. A cold seed of doubt, long dormant, began to sprout. Why had my father sold that house, her sanctuary, so quickly after she was gone? The doubt became an engine. Fueled by a gut feeling I couldn't ignore, I got in my car and drove the 2 hours south into the Virginia countryside. The old house now belonged to a new family. I rehearsed a story in my head, but when a kind-faced woman opened the door, I simply told her the truth. I told her about my mother and about a cedar box and a memory that didn't make sense. She listened with a sympathy that felt foreign and wonderful. To my astonishment, she let me in. "Your father's men cleared out most of the big stuff," she said, leading me up a narrow staircase. "But they left a few old trunks in the attic. Said they were just junk." In the dusty, sun-drenched attic, I found it, an old steamer trunk with my mother's initials, LV, stenciled on the side. Inside, beneath neatly folded linens that still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets, was her journal. I sat on the floorboards, pages filled with her graceful script, detailing thoughts on her garden, lines of poetry she loved, pressed flowers. Then I turned to the final entry. The handwriting was shaky, a frail echo of its former strength, but the words were a beacon. "Don't let them erase you, my fierce girl. Your legacy isn't in the stars on a collar, but in this soil. Find Eleanor Croft." Eleanor Croft. The name jolted me. My mother's old lawyer, a formidable woman, now retired in Charlottesville. The next day I was sitting in her sunlit study, the journal open on the table between us. Eleanor, with her sharp, intelligent eyes, adjusted her glasses and read the last page. A slow, grim smile touched her lips. "I've been waiting for you for 10 years, Shelby," she said softly. She swiveled in her leather chair, turned the dial on a large black safe, and pulled out a thick, yellowed file folder tied with a faded red ribbon. She laid it on the desk. It was my mother's last will and testament, the original, and it was nothing like the version my father had presented. My mother had left the entire Virginia property and a considerable trust fund to me, not to Kaylin, to me. And it came with a single breathtaking condition: to use the funds to establish the Lillian House, a retreat and safe haven for female veterans suffering from the visible and invisible wounds of war. My inheritance wasn't just money or land, it was a mission, a purpose, a legacy that my father had stolen and buried. "Your father presented a forged will," Eleanor explained, her voice hardening. "He faked your mother's signature. He argued that a center like this was a sign of weakness, an admission of failure that would tarnish the Vance family name. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart didn't just crack, they shattered. The quiet anger I had nurtured for a decade was no longer a smoldering ember. It erupted into a wildfire. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about a house. This was about my father strangling my mother's dying wish, extinguishing the final beautiful testament of her love, all to protect his own fragile, monstrous ego. My war was no longer just about reclaiming a soldier's honor. It was now a daughter's war, to reclaim a mother's legacy from the hands of a tyrant. My visit to Eleanor Croft had apparently made waves. I knew my father. He wouldn't let a threat to his carefully curated world go unanswered. He wouldn't attack head-on. That wasn't his style. He preferred covert operations, psychological warfare. I just didn't expect the first strike to arrive at my door holding a pecan pie. It was a Tuesday evening. I was deep in the digital trenches of Sentinel, analyzing a potential threat stream from Eastern Europe. When the security intercom buzzed, I glanced at the monitor. It was Kalen, my brother, standing awkwardly in the hallway in civilian clothes, a white bakery box in his hands. My heart gave a painful lurch. It had been years since we had spoken alone, years since he had been anything more than a figure in a dress uniform at a family event I was barely invited to. A small, naive part of me, the girl who used to play hide-and-seek with him in the sprawling backyard of our Virginia home, wanted to swing the door open to see if the brother I once knew was still in there. But the rest of me, Major Grant, the ghost he had publicly ignored in the Hall of Honor, sounded the alarm. This wasn't a social call. This was reconnaissance. Our father had sent him. Still, I buzzed him in. Old habits die hard. As I opened my apartment door, a lifetime of training in intelligence kicked in. Analyze the intent, not the words. "Kalen," I said, my voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "What are you doing here?" He held out the box like a peace offering. "Serafina made pecan pie. She knows it's your favorite." The warm, buttery scent of toasted pecans and brown sugar drifted into my apartment, a Trojan horse carrying memories of long-ago Sunday dinners, of a time when I still belonged. It was a perfectly calculated move, designed to soften me, to remind me of a life I had lost. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning my Spartan apartment with its bookshelves overflowing with technical manuals and the whiteboard covered in complex code. He looked out of place, a diplomat in a war room. He sat on the edge of my sofa. "Dad knows you went to see Eleanor Croft," he began, his tone gentle, practiced. "He's worried about you, Shelby. He doesn't want you getting stirred up over old history." The words were soft, but the message was as clear and hard as a field command: stand down. He started talking about the Vance family legacy, about the importance of keeping things quiet, of not causing a disruption. It was the same speech I'd heard my entire life, the doctrine of appearances over truth. Then he deployed his main weapon. "Look," he said, leaning forward. "Dad said that if you drop this lawsuit about the land, he'll use his influence to have your military record reviewed. He can get your honor reinstated, quietly, no fuss. You get what you've always wanted, and the family isn't dragged through the mud. It's a fair trade, isn't it?" A fair trade. My honor, the very thing he had stripped from me, was now being dangled as a bargaining chip. I stared into my brother's eyes, searching for a flicker of the boy I once knew, a hint of genuine concern. I found nothing. There was only the programmed obedience of a loyal subordinate, carrying out his commander's orders. My father wasn't extending an olive branch. He was trying to buy my silence, using my own stolen legacy as the currency. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost impressive. Slowly, I stood up. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the bakery box, and placed it back in Kalen's hands. His own hands felt limp holding it. "Tell Dad," I said, my voice no longer warm, no longer sisterly, but cold and steady as steel, "that my honor is not for sale, and neither is my mother's." Surprise flickered across Kalen's face, quickly replaced by a familiar frustration, the look he always got when I wouldn't fall in line. "You don't get it, do you, Shelby?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You can't win against him. You'll just destroy everything." "Maybe," I replied, walking to the door and holding it open. but I won't lose on his terms. The space between us was no longer that of a brother and sister. It was a battlefield. Thanks for stopping by, Captain. I used his rank deliberately, a verbal blade severing the last thread of familial intimacy. We were no longer Shelby and Kaylin. In this room, at this moment, we were opposing forces. He looked at me, the pie box still in his hands, a useless, poisoned offering. Then he turned and walked out. As the door clicked shut, the silence of my apartment felt different. It was no longer the silence of retreat. It was the calm, focused silence before a declaration of war. And I had just officially declared it. Kaylin's poisoned offer confirmed my worst fear. My father would do anything to bury the past. But it also meant there was something far more damning to bury than a forged will. A question began to haunt me, echoing in the silence of my apartment long after my brother had gone. Why was the after-action report changed so quickly? What really happened to the first one? The one thing my father couldn't control, the one thing he couldn't rewrite, was personal correspondence. And Maya Jimenez, meticulous and devoted, had written to her mother every single week without fail. I knew in my bones that she would have written one last letter, and I had to find it. It was the final act of loyalty I owed her. My semper fidelis wasn't to a man or a rank. It was to her memory. The next morning, I drove south to the Marine Corps Archives at Quantico, Virginia. The building was a sprawling, sterile labyrinth of beige filing cabinets and the quiet hum of climate control, a tomb for forgotten stories and inconvenient truths. I felt like I was entering the belly of the beast. The man behind the counter was a master sergeant, old school, with a face like a road map of forgotten battles and eyes that had seen far too much. He listened patiently as I filled out the request form. When he read the name, Sergeant Maya Jimenez, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He typed her name into his computer, his fingers moving slowly. A moment later, he looked up at me, his expression guarded. "This file's been flagged, Major," he said, his voice a low, cautionary rumble. "Senior command access only, by direct request from General Vance's office." My heart sank. Another door slammed shut in my face, locked and bolted by my own father. I could feel the frustration rising like bile in my throat. I could have pulled rank, made a scene, but I knew it would be useless. Instead, I changed tactics. I leaned forward, my voice dropping, losing its official edge. "Master Sergeant," I began, "I'm Major Shelby Grant." I let the name hang in the air, the Grant that was tethered to Vance. I saw a flicker of recognition, of understanding in his weary eyes. "I'm not asking as an officer reviewing a file. I'm asking as a commander who lost one of her own." I held his gaze, letting him see the decade of unresolved grief uncarried. I was there. "I need to know what she said, please." He stared at me for a long, silent moment, his jaw working. He was weighing his career against the plea of a fellow Marine. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, a sound of resignation. "Wait here," he grunted, and disappeared into the endless rows of files. He returned not with a thick file, but with a single manila envelope, yellowed with age. A stark red stamp was emblazoned across the front. "Return to sender, non-deliverable." My hands trembled as I took it from him. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, covered in Maya's familiar, neat handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I began to read. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Please don't be sad for too long. I did what I thought was right. We got hit hard today, real hard. Major Grant made a call. Some people are going to say it was the wrong one, but they weren't there. They didn't see the little girl. I followed Major Grant. I didn't follow the order, I followed her. Because she was doing the right thing. She saved that kid, Mom, and she tried to save me too. I saw the IED. I had to cover her. I yelled for her to go. The letter blurred as tears I hadn't shed in 10 years finally fell, splattering onto the fragile paper. The final lines were a gut punch, a key unlocking the prison of guilt I had lived in for so long. Tell her I don't blame her. Tell her I was proud to serve with her. Tell her I trusted her more than anyone in this whole damn Corps. The crushing weight on my soul, the guilt that had defined my existence, evaporated. It wasn't just absolution, it was a resurrection. Maya hadn't died because of my failure. She had died because of her own courage, her own choice, her own faith in me. I looked up at the Master Sergeant, my voice hoarse. Why was this never sent? Why was it stopped? He looked at me with an expression of profound sympathy. An order like that, to intercept a deceased Marine's personal effects? It can only come from two places, Major, the direct next of kin or an officer of general rank. And just like that, every last piece fell into place. My father. It was always my father. He hadn't just abandoned me in my darkest hour. He had actively, deliberately stolen my exoneration. He had silenced Maya's last words, desecrated her memory, and let me drown in a guilt he could have washed away with a single command, all to protect his own pristine image. The anger that rose in me wasn't hot and explosive. It was glacial. It was a cold, pure, clarifying rage that froze my grief and sorrow into a single, sharp point. And I have to ask you, if you were in my shoes, if you discovered a betrayal this deep, what would you do? Would you let it go for the sake of peace, or would you burn their world to the ground to honor the truth? I knew my answer. I carefully folded the letter, a sacred text now, and slid it into the inner pocket of my jacket. It felt warm against my chest. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," I said, my voice steady and clear. As I walked out of the archives and into the stark Virginia sunlight, I was no longer a ghost running from her past. I was a hunter. And the hunting season had just officially begun. The hunter's first move is not to attack, but to prepare. My apartment was no longer a refuge. It was a command center. The whiteboard where I once mapped out Sentinel's algorithms was wiped clean. In its place, I drew a new kind of network diagram, my father's web of power. It was a complex chart of connections, obligations, and most importantly, vulnerabilities. The cold fury I'd felt leaving the archives had been honed into a razor-sharp strategic focus. I fell back on the combat decision-making cycle that had been drilled into me since I was a cadet, the OODA loop. Observe, I laid out my arsenal on the dining table, Maya's letter, my mother's will. Old emails, financial statements I'd requested, a complete intelligence picture, Orient. I analyzed the data. My father's greatest weakness wasn't legal. He had layers of influence to protect him there. His true vulnerability, his center of gravity, was his public image. His obsession with the untarnished Vance family honor. Decide, I would not fight him on his strongest front, the military courts or a lengthy civil battle. I would fight him on the stage he himself had so carefully constructed. I would turn his own PR machine against him. Act, but I couldn't do it alone. A lone wolf dies, a pack survives. My first call was to Echo. I need you to do something for me, I said, my voice low and steady. Find every digital trace connected to the revised after-action report from Sangin. I want to know who accessed it, who changed it, when, and from where. There was no hesitation on the other end of the encrypted line. Copy that, Ghost. No questions asked. That was Echo. My second call was to Eleanor Croft. Eleanor, I said, we're filing the suit, not to reclaim the land immediately. We're filing a motion to seal and preserve yet all documents related to my mother's estate. Effective immediately. We need to apply pressure and buy time. The old lawyer let out a dry chuckle. I like the way you think, Major. Consider it done. While my allies moved in the shadows, I focused on the main event. In my research, I unearthed something so profoundly hypocritical, it made my blood run cold. My father, General Harrison Vance, had established a scholarship fund in the name of Sergeant Maya Sparky Jimenez at the Virginia Military Institute. Every year, he personally attended the ceremony, delivering a moving speech about sacrifice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of the Corps. He was using Maya's death, the death he had covered up, as a tool to burnish his own legacy. He had turned my friend's tragedy into his personal PR campaign. The rage was immense, but then a cold clarity cut through it. This was it. This was the weapon. He had built the stage for his own downfall. My next call was the hardest. It was to Maya's mother, Maria Jimenez. The first few minutes were difficult. She was polite but distant, still believing the carefully crafted story General Vance had told her years ago, that her daughter had died following a reckless, emotional commander. I listened patiently. Then I took a deep breath. Mrs. Jimenez, I said, my voice gentle. I have something you need to hear. It's from Maya. I read her the last letter, my voice cracking only once. As I spoke Maya's words of trust and forgiveness, for a long moment, the only sound on the line was Maria's soft, heartbroken sobbing. The wall of lies my father had built around her had finally crumbled. Now it was time to spring the trap. The plan took shape with military precision, a comprehensive package of documents, a certified copy of my mother's real will, along with a formal request for an investigation into fraudulent activity, was messengered to the office of a JAG Corps lawyer I knew to be a man of integrity, someone outside my father's sphere of influence. That was the first pressure point. Simultaneously, Eleanor's lawsuit would hit the civil court system, freezing all of my mother's assets and making the forged will a matter of public record. The second pressure point. The final piece arrived late one night in an encrypted email from Echo. Got it, Ghost. The metadata from the altered AAR file shows a clear access trail. The final version was uploaded from a secure, off-site IP address. An old one, registered under one name, Lieutenant General Harrison Vance. He did it himself. I stared at the screen, a grim satisfaction settling over me. I had everything, the motive, the means, and now the digital fingerprint of the murderer of my career. The bait was laid. The nets were in place. All I had to do now was wait for the shark to smell the blood in the water and charge. My calculated moves had triggered an earthquake, and the summons was the first aftershock. I was ordered to report to General Thorne's office at the Pentagon for an emergency meeting. The night before, my father had called, his voice a chillingly calm instrument of psychological warfare. "You're tearing this family apart over a moment of sentimentality," he'd said, his words precise. "Your mother, she would be so ashamed." He tried to use her memory as his final weapon. It didn't work. It only strengthened my resolve. When I entered Thorne's ornate, wood-paneled office, the air was thick with tension. My father was already there, seated ramrod straight in a deep burgundy leather chair opposite the general's imposing desk. His face was a mask of stone, but I could see the frantic calculations behind his eyes. Kaylin stood awkwardly in the corner by the draped American and Marine Corps flags. Looking pale and utterly trapped, a soldier caught in a crossfire he couldn't comprehend. My father's eyes locked onto mine, burning with a cold fire. "You never know when to stop, do you?" he hissed, the words a low threat meant only for me. I walked further into the room, stopping directly in front of his chair, forcing him to look up at me. "No," I replied, my voice calm but laced with the very fire he had ignited in me. "But I know when to begin." General Thorne, who had been watching us with the quiet intensity that had earned him the moniker Ironclad, broke the charged silence. He didn't speak. He simply rose, turned to the large safe behind his desk, and spun the heavy dial with a series of decisive clicks. He swung the heavy door open and pulled out a single thin file. He placed it on the polished mahogany between my father and me. The soft thud it made sounded as loud as a cannon shot. It was the original after-action report from Senguin. "I've held on to this for 10 years, Harrison," Thorne said, his voice the low rumble of distant thunder. "I was waiting for the day Major Grant uncovered the truth for herself, not for it to be handed down. I wanted to see what kind of steel she was made of. It appears my faith was not misplaced." My father's composure finally cracked. He stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake, his face draining of color. For the first time, I saw him speechless, his arsenal of authority rendered useless. "You wanted silence to protect a hollow legacy," Thorne continued, his voice rising with righteous fury. "I call it what it is, cowardice. A Marine officer does not leave his own behind, not in life, and certainly not in death. You forgot the meaning of Semper Fidelis, General." He fixed my father with a stare that could melt steel. The annual Maya Sparky Jimenez Memorial Scholarship Ceremony at the Virginia Military Institute was as stately as ever. The historic auditorium was filled with cadets in their crisp gray uniforms. A sea of young, hopeful faces who saw the men on stage as paragons. My father was there, seated amongst the honored guests, preparing to deliver his yearly speech on honor. He looked out at the crowd, a benign patriarch, a pillar of the community. He had no idea he was standing on a trap door. When the time came for his address, the master of ceremonies called his name with reverence. But before my father could rise, General Thorne stood and walked to the podium. A murmur of confusion rippled through the hall. "Cadets, guests, Mrs. Jimenez," Thorne began, his voice booming through the auditorium, needing no microphone. "We are here to honor a fallen hero. We often speak of honor, but sometimes the greatest honor we can pay the fallen is to rescue the truth from the grave, where it has been buried by fear and pride." He paused, letting his words settle. "Today, we are not just honoring the memory of Sergeant Jimenez. We are honoring the truth of her sacrifice." His eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on me, standing quietly in the back. "Major Shelby Grant, will you please come forward?" A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air from the room. 1,000 heads turned. I walked down the center aisle, my back straight, my footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. I was wearing my dress blues, the uniform I had earned, the uniform that had been taken from me, now fully restored. I walked onto the stage and stood facing my father. The look on his face was a collage of shock, fury, and dawning horror. General Thorne held up a single yellowed piece of paper. "This is the last letter Sergeant Jimenez ever wrote," he announced to the transfixed audience. It was illegally hidden for 10 years. It's time her real voice was heard. And then he read it. He read Maya's words of loyalty, of courage, of unwavering faith. He read her exoneration of me. I didn't follow the order. I followed her. Tell her I don't blame her. Tell her I trusted her more than anyone in this whole damn corps. Each word was a note in a symphony of truth, washing over the auditorium, cleansing a decade of poisonous lies. In the front row, Maria Jimenez, Maya's mother, was openly weeping, her tears ones of pride and release. I risked a glance at Kaylin, who stood near the wings of the stage. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of profound, gut-wrenching shame and dawning admiration. And my father, he just stood there, frozen. A statue crumbling from the inside out. His legacy, his honor, his entire fabricated world, turning to dust before the eyes of the very cadets he sought to inspire. The patriarch had been unmasked on his own stage. When he finished reading, General Thorne folded the letter with reverence, turned to me, and executed the sharpest, most respectful salute I had ever seen. "On behalf of a grateful United States Marine Corps," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "Welcome home, Major. I brought my own hand up, my movements crisp, my form perfect." I met his salute, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. And as my hand fell, the silence was shattered. A single pair of hands started clapping, the master sergeant from the archives who stood near the exit. Then another and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar of approval, a wave of acceptance and respect that washed over me, healing wounds I didn't even know were still open. The ghost of 8th, and I was a ghost no more. I had been resurrected in the brilliant, unforgiving light of the truth. The thunderous applause at the VMI ceremony eventually faded, but the storm I had unleashed did not. In the days that followed, my world was anything but quiet. My phone rang incessantly, a relentless barrage of calls from journalists hungry for a scandal, from former colleagues offering awkward, belated apologies, and of course from the wreckage of my family. My stepmother, Serafina, was the first to call. Her voice was a venomous hiss of silk and acid. "Are you happy now?" she seethed. "Look what you've done. You've ruined your father. You've destroyed this family, all for your own selfish pride." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing left to say. I just listened to her tirade, a final textbook example of blaming the victim. Then I quietly pressed end and blocked her number. A quote from Brené Brown that I'd read years ago floated into my mind. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. The relief of victory was mingled with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I had won the war, but the battlefield was littered with the last vestiges of the family ties I had once desperately tried to hold on to. I sat in my quiet apartment, watching the rain streak down the window pane, feeling both empty and strangely at peace. The official fallout was swift but quiet. General Vance was never criminally charged. His network of influence was still strong enough to shield him from that ultimate disgrace. But he was forced into an immediate and silent retirement. For a man obsessed with his legacy, it was a fate worse than prison. His name was quietly removed from a building dedication at Quantico. The invitations to speak at military functions and corporate boards evaporated. He became a ghost in the world he once ruled, a pariah in the circles that once revered him. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. There was no satisfaction in his downfall. There was only a quiet, lingering sadness for the man who had chosen a pristine image over his own daughter, who had gained the world, and in the end, lost the only things that truly mattered. A week later, Kaylin asked to meet. We sat at a small, secluded table in a quiet coffee shop in Old Town Alexandria. He looked 10 years older, the confident swagger of the golden boy completely gone, replaced by the heavy stoop of a man carrying an immense weight. "I'm sorry, Shelby," he said, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. He couldn't meet my eyes. I was a coward. I was so afraid of him, of losing my place. I'm sorry." He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table between us. It was his old unit insignia, the one from the platoon we had briefly served in together so long ago. "I don't deserve this anymore," he said, "but you do." I looked at my brother, truly looked at him, and saw not the favored son, but just a broken man trying to find his moral compass again. I pushed the insignia back across the table toward him. "Courage isn't about never being afraid, Kaylin," I said softly, echoing our mother's words. "It's about doing the right thing even when you are. Start now." He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears, and nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The lawsuit over my mother's will was resolved quickly and without a trial. Faced with irrefutable evidence of forgery and the looming public scandal, my father conceded everything. We met one last time at the notary's office to sign the final transfer documents. He sat across the polished table from me, a bitter, defeated old man, and refused to look at me. He signed the papers with a stiff, angry flourish. When all the legal formalities were complete and the estate of Lillian Vance was officially mine, I walked over to where he stood by the door. He flinched as I approached, as if expecting one final blow. "I don't hate you, Dad," I said, my voice quiet and clear, devoid of the anger that had fueled me for so long. "I just won't allow you to hurt me anymore." And with that, I turned and walked away. And I did not look back. I had closed the door on the house of Vance. Ahead of me was another door, a new one. A door I would build myself, for my mother, for Maya, and for me. A year later, I stood on my mother's land in the Virginia countryside. The air was sweet with the smell of wild grass and damp earth after a spring rain. This place was no longer a piece of evidence in a lawsuit. It was home. The skeletal frame of a new building rose against the backdrop of rolling green hills. This was the Lillian house. I wasn't alone. Echo had relocated from his digital cave to oversee our network security. Kaylin, who had quietly resigned his commission, was there. His hands calloused from hauling lumber, his face finally free of the shadows that had haunted him. He was finding his own way to honor our mother, and there was a rotating crew of volunteers, mostly veterans, both men and women, who had heard our story and wanted to help. The sharp, rhythmic sound of hammers, the easy laughter, and the shared stories had replaced the silence and pain that had defined this land for a decade. We weren't just building with brick and mortar, we were building a community, a sanctuary for women warriors the system had left behind, just as it had once left me. In the evenings, we'd gather around a large bonfire, drinking cheap beer out of the bottle and sharing a massive pot of chili that someone had cooked. There were no tense family dinners here, no veiled insults or carefully constructed lies. There was a former helicopter pilot with PTSD who still flinched at loud noises, a combat nurse battling an opioid addiction she'd acquired after her own injury, and a logistics officer who had been sexually harassed out of her career. Each woman carried her own set of scars, her own ghosts. But here, under the vast, starry Virginia sky, those scars weren't marks of shame. They were proof of survival. We were a family forged from broken pieces, and because of that, we were stronger and more resilient than anything built on a foundation of deceit. On the day of the dedication ceremony for the Lillian House, I stood at a makeshift podium, looking out at a small crowd of supporters, volunteers, and the first group of women who would call this place home. I spoke of my mother's vision, of second chances, and of the words of Eleanor Roosevelt that had become my mantra. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. After the speeches, as people mingled and shared plates of barbecue, a shy teenager approached me. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Maya Jimenez's daughter, now a young woman with the same bright, determined eyes as her mother. "My mom, she told me you were the bravest person she ever knew," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I'm applying to the Naval Academy next year. I want to serve like you both did." Her words were a bridge, connecting the painful past to a hopeful future. Maya's sacrifice wasn't an end. It was an inspiration. I knelt to be at her eye level, the weight of the last decade finally, completely lifting from my shoulders. "Then you have to promise me something," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. I held her gaze, wanting her to understand the importance of this lesson, the one I had to learn the hardest way possible. "Promise me you will never ever let anyone else write you out of your own story. You own it, always." She nodded, a fierce resolve hardening her young features. "I promise, ma'am." I smiled, a real unburdened smile, and stood up. I looked at the women around me, their faces full of hope. I looked at the house built of truth and love. I was no longer a forgotten name on a misplaced place card, no longer a ghost haunting the halls of 8th and I. I had found my purpose. My legacy wasn't the stars on a collar or a name etched in stone. It was this place. It was these healed lives and the ones yet to come. And that was a legacy that would echo forever, a sound that could never be silenced. My story found its ending on that plot of land in Virginia, but I know it's not the only one. I know that many of you listening have walked your own difficult paths, faced your own silent battles, and fought to have your truth heard. Please remember this: your voice matters, your story has value. If you feel moved to do so, I invite you to share a piece of your journey in the comments below. Let's create a space where no story is left in the shadows. Our channel is a home for these stories of resilience and justice. To be a part of this community and to ensure you never miss the next one, please subscribe and turn on all notifications. Thank you for listening.